Hello and welcome to question and answer number 118. I am your host, Panyo Basa, as usual, and this is my beverage. So, I'm doing kind of a nocturnal Q&A today, or this evening, I should say, because I was busy earlier today, so it's going to be more, the lighting is going to be more subdued, I guess. I was running around doing things, like I went to this aquarium swap meet to offload some of my excess hornwort. Those of you who have been keeping up with my Q&As and my other videos may know that I've had an issue with hornwort over the past few months, and the stuff grows like an inch a day, and so I've got to prune that hornwort plant, that monstrous plant zilla back there in that aquarium, because it would just take over the entire aquarium. And so I go and offload the hornwort. I just gave it away for free. I didn't like the idea of just flushing it down the toilet or throwing it in the garbage or something. Then I walked into a nearby pet store the aquarium club swap meet thing was going on in the parking lot of this pet store. I go into this pet store. They've got wild type male dwarf gouramis that I had been looking for in vain for months. And now I don't really have room in my aquarium, so that was kind of a shocking blow to me earlier today. Furthermore, they were even on sale. I've been looking for them for months. I even tried to order one and they sent me the wrong kind. Then I finally find them on sale and my aquarium's already full of fish and I really shouldn't get one. Also, because I haven't been working lately, haven't been working the old 9 to 5 grind or 8 to 5, that I'm kind of reverting back to my nocturnal ways anyway. Just my woman and I both prefer, if just left to our natural nature, to get up late and go to bed late. We're just not morning people. I don't even fully trust morning people. So, one more little announcement before I start answering questions is that my good friend Brian and I did a few videos yesterday, and I'm not sure if they're going to go on YouTube because YouTube is rather censorious and disapproves of certain people being featured on their site. So it might be an alt tech exclusives like later on this week. It possibly may go on YouTube. I don't know. I might experimentally try one just to see how long the video stays up before it gets taken back down again by digital big brother or big sister, more like. So you got that to look forward to. You can look for it on BitChute or Rumble. If little videos that I did with Brian don't show up on YouTube, they'll still be up on BitChute and Rumble. And so we got lots of questions. We got more than the usual number lately, and so I should just dive right into these things. And the first question is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, what would a Buddhist journey to hell, like a Buddhist Dante's Inferno, and a journey to heaven, like Dante's Paradiso, look like? Well, I've read Dante's Inferno. I never read the Paradiso. Everyone says that the Inferno is really interesting, but the Paradiso, and then he's got like the middle, man, it's not limbo. It's purgatory, the Purgatorio, that both of those are fairly boring. And there's just not much going on in the Christian heaven, apparently. So, hell is more interesting. William Blake also agreed in his Marriage of Heaven and Hell that hell is just way more interesting than heaven. It's just all you got in heaven is kind of just bliss bordering on boredom, according to certain Christians anyway. So I don't really know how a Buddhist visit to heaven realms would compare with Dante's version, because I never read Dante's version. Very few people have read Dante's version of his trip to heaven, where he's just totally simping on this certain woman named Beatrice. But a Buddhist journey to hell, I mean, for one thing, in Dante's hell, it's got different levels, but in the Buddhist version, each level is its own hell. You can't really travel in between. Each hell is a different hell. So, I mean, you'd have to like do some astral traveling from one realm to the next. You couldn't just walk like Virgil and Dante did through hell. And I mean, you'd probably find some famous people down there. Probably not very many Guelphs and Ghibellines, which Dante was continually encountering in his Inferno, who were like the two main political factions in in Italy at that time. So, I mean, you go down, it's hot. The Buddhist descriptions of hell, usually, I mean, there's all these different levels of hell, but not very many of them get described. Mainly, the one that gets described the most is Avicii hell, which is the very bottom. So that would be comparable to the plane of ice with Satan in the center, and he's chewing on, I think it was Judas with one. He had three mouths. He's chewing on Judas with one mouth, and Brutus, I think, he was chewing with the other mouth, the guy who betrayed Julius Caesar, and the third mouth was left empty, just waiting for Mr. 666 to wind up in hell so that he could get chewed on with the other mouth. But Avicii hell is not a plane of ice. The hell realms are generally considered to be very hot, just like glowing iron. And you've got the standard demons with not necessarily pitchforks, but other sharp, pointy implements that they're causing, just untold misery onto the beings there. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all there is to Buddhist hell. There's really not a whole lot of description other than it's just hot and miserable, and there's demons, and everyone's thirsty because it's so hot. And I don't know. I don't think it'd really be that good of a place. I think you could possibly get like PTSD or something from really visiting hell, unless you just really had the kind of mental fortitude that Dante apparently had. So I guess that, I mean, the heaven realms, I guess I could sort of describe what a visit to the heaven realms would be like. Each heaven is its own realm, so it's not just one heaven like in Christianity, or like mainstream Christianity anyway. You've got this different heavens, and it could be divided up into three levels. You've got like the Deva realms, which are part of the Kamaloka, or the sensual cosmos, the sensual world, which includes us humans, even though we are not in heaven. Includes all of the lower realms, animals and ghosts and humans, and then also all of the lower heaven realms. And they're just considered to be like paradise. I mean, it's like sort of a pagan idea of paradise, even maybe a Muslim idea of paradise, where it's just like being a rich, beautiful person here that never gets sick and lives for millions of years, and anything you want, you can get it. And there's all kinds of sensual pleasures and beautiful parks and golden mansions studded with like jewels and all this kind of stuff. And then you get up higher than that, you get into the Brahma realms, which is the Rupa Loka, or the realm of form, the world of form. And there it's starting to get more like some attempt at a Christian heaven, where everything is chill. There's no division of male and female. There's the Brahmas kind of counterintuitively have, I think they only have like 2 sense organs instead of, I think they've got like this, they can see, and then they've got the mental senses. I don't think they even have a sense of touch. And probably not a whole heck of a lot's going on up there. They're mostly just like chilling out in a state of bliss. And above that, you got the Arupa Loka, or formless realm, where if you went up there, you might not see anything because it's pure mind and nobody has a body. And there it's even more chill, where, I mean, they can't even do anything. They just kind of abide in bliss, and there doesn't seem to be much point to it. So a Buddhist journey to hell, or a Buddhist journey to heaven. I mean, probably, I mean, this whole question may have been elicited from me discussing this meditation center in Burma, not far from where I was living at the time, in like northwestern Burma, Sagaing division, where they were guaranteeing that your very first retreat, within just a matter of days, you'd be able to visit heaven realms and visit hell realms, and you'd be able to sit for hours without moving and all the kinds of things. And I would guess that probably they were being hypnotized. And so in a case like that, you know, where you're relying on your imagination, like it's probably the case with Dante also, where you're just relying on your own Buddhist imagination, then it's going to be different for each person, and it's not going to be very realistic, probably. So, yeah, I mean, just imagine for yourself what a Buddhist hell would be like, and imagine for yourself what a Buddhist heaven would be like, and just make that more vivid, and that would be what your visit to heaven and hell would be like, if it is, as it is in many cases, where you think you're in this meditative state and you think you're astral traveling to these places, when really it's like hypnotic imagination. So, considering that we got lots of questions, I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' second question, which is, as an experienced monk, do you think guarding or being mindful of the sense doors is a reliable way to reach detachment from greed, aversion, and delusion, or is something more than that required? Other traditions like Hinduism posit many different kinds of yogas, whereas Buddhism, at least Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, seems to imply that there is only one real method to the absolute, or one yoga, that being forming a mindful and wholesome relationship with the senses, and hence all of samsara by extension. After all, isn't the genius of Buddhism to recognize this dependent origination? Well, going with like the Hindu idea of yogas, Buddhism would be like Raja Yoga. Maybe a little bit of Jnana Yoga combined, you know, the yoga of knowledge, but mainly it's like the King Yoga, which is the yoga of like meditative practice. I mean, there could be other kinds of yoga. You know, you got Bhakti Yoga, which is devotionalism, and you've got Karma Yoga, which is works. You know, like Mahatma Gandhi was a karma yogi. Like devotees of a guru would tend to be like Bhakti yogis. But in Theravada Buddhism, especially early Buddhism, it was mainly Raja Yoga, just meditative spiritual practice. This sort of solitude, contemplation, austerity. That would be the general route of practice for an early Indian Buddhist. So let's see here. Do I think guarding or being mindful of the sense doors is a reliable way to reach detachment from greed, aversion, and delusion? Or is something more than that required? Well, I mean, there are other things that are generally added to that path, like basic morality, also like austerity, like I already mentioned, and like solitude. Solitude is important because it's much easier to be mindful and to guard the sense doors when you're not being distracted all the time. You don't have a lot of stuff going on, not lots of commotion, not people demanding your attention, talking to you in symbolic language that, I mean, you've got to like go into like samsaric mode to deal with this stuff. So if you're just off alone, staring at a blank wall in a cave, for example, then you've got way less distraction, way less stuff that is like kind of keeping you from practicing very deeply. So it's like a package deal. It's not just one thing that you practice if you're a Buddhist. I mean, guarding the sense doors is kind of a broad term that can include different practices. Even you could say basic morality is kind of guarding the sense doors, in that you're like reducing the odds of shit hitting the fan karmically in your future by just moral self-restraint. But I mean, it's not just a one-fold path. Orthodox Buddhism teaches an eightfold path, which includes a number of things, not just being mindful, which is step 7 on the eightfold path. Samasati, right mindfulness, would be pretty much what is Philalethes is talking about here. But there's a lot of other stuff too. If you don't have right view at the beginning, where you don't even know how to practice, I mean, it takes a certain amount of study just in order to find out, why you should practice, how you should practice, that kind of thing. So it is a package deal. There's all kinds of things, although ultimately guarding the sense doors and mindfulness, I mean, that's like the apex of practice. So in a sense, it is that is the most likely to increase your odds of becoming enlightened. If you're just very moral, but you don't have much wisdom, you're not cultivating wisdom, you're just kind of stuck in samsara at the same time that you're being very moral. I mean, cows do that, and they're not particularly enlightened, unless maybe you think that all animals that are not human are enlightened. And there are some people like Eckhart Tolle who teach something along those lines. But for example, if you're guarding your sense doors and you're being mindful, greed, hate, and delusion, or attraction, aversion, and semi-conscious stupidity, they're less likely to be a problem, or at least they're not as big of a problem. Because let's say you're guarding the sense doors, you're being mindful, and then like something pleasant arises, some pleasant sight, or you get some really good food in your bowl that day, then, I mean, even if greed starts to arise, if you're mindful of it, then, it sort of neutralizes the greed. It takes away most of the karmic force of that greed. And if you're just guarding the sense doors, when you're looking into your bowl, you're just seeing shapes and colors. You're not interpreting that as, ooh, mangoes, I like mangoes. So guarding the sense doors kind of reduces the stimuli coming into your mind into just as close to raw data as possible, without all the interpretation of I like this and I don't like that, and this is better than that, and all the rest. And then just being mindful, even if that stuff does start to arise, you're mindful of it, you're observing it, it's not you anymore. It's just mental states arising. So that's advanced practice, although there are a number of other things like solitude, moral restraint, austerity, that kind of stuff that set the groundwork for advanced practice. So that's sort of like the morality and so forth is like the coarse adjust knob. And then when you get really good at that, and then like the fine adjust knob would be like guarding the sense doors and practicing mindfulness, and also cultivating deep meditative states like jhana. So I think I'll just move on to Philalethes' third question, which is, why is someone who has attained lasting insight into reality not reborn? I am wondering what exactly is the mechanism at work here. And mainly, what gets you reborn is your karma. And when you become enlightened, you have neutralized your karma. It doesn't have momentum anymore. It's like the momentum of your mind is what causes you to be reborn into another birth. Mainly, it's even to a large degree what carries you from one moment to the next. And then you've just transcended that. It's how to explain it. It's like momentum. I mean, if according to physics, momentum is mass times velocity. So the velocity might still be there, but by being mindful, you've kind of neutralized the mass. So if you got zero mass, it's like you realize it's not substantial. There's no underlying absolute essence to it. And so in a way, you've just sort of like removed the mass from what you're doing. That's sort of like mindfulness practice kind of reduces the velocity of or the momentum of your mind by just kind of neutralizing the substance. Whereas if you're doing jhana, like deep meditative states where your mind just becomes motionless, of course, then you're neutralizing the velocity. Although doing that is only temporary. And then once you stop being in jhana, then it just returns again. So, in a way, it's what you're doing is you're neutralizing your karma. Still, technically, they say an enlightened being has like kama vipaka, or the fruition of past karma, but they're not making any new karma. And the mechanism, exactly what causes that past karma alone, from before you were enlightened to cause you to get reborn again, that's kind of a question that isn't discussed much in early Buddhist philosophy. Although technically, it seems to me this is all pretty much an illusion anyway. It's virtual reality. And when you reach ultimate reality, what happens in the virtual reality it's just sort of not exactly canceled out. It just becomes irrelevant. It's like, the statues in the uncarved block of stone, the statues are really in there. That's kind of like what our life is like. We're one of those statues that's in this uncarved block of stone. But once you realize it's the uncarved block of stone, it's just stone, with the statues just being largely imagination, then it doesn't even matter what the statues are doing in there, because they're not really, they're just virtual, potential, conditional statues in there anyway. So in a way, that's kind of punting the ball, I guess. It's like saying, it's like when you transcend the illusion, what happens in the illusion doesn't really matter anymore. It might be that it seems like arahants are being reborn or some such, but it's all just irrelevant because there's really nobody there. There's nobody identifying with those arahants. But it's really difficult to talk about this sort of thing, and people stubbornly persist in trying to get me to explain like ultimate reality, which can't be explained. And there's going to be at least one more question on the scroll. I don't try to figure out how to answer these questions at the time that I'm collating them, just putting them on the list. I'm just cutting and pasting. So a lot of the time I haven't really fully read the question until I read them here. Although occasionally I will see a question and think, oh, that's interesting. That's a good question. And then, kind of think about it a little bit. But anyways, the next question is from Don Fades. And Don Fades says, with regard to the 16 steps, and the 16 steps are like 16 ways of practicing mindfulness of breathing, as found in the Anapana Sutta, or is it the Anapanasati Sutta? It's how to practice mindfulness of breathing, Anapanasati. And there's these 16 steps, and some of it's identical to what's found in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta when it's discussing mindfulness of breathing. And I don't consider it to be very good advice. The way it is laid down in the suttas is just unrealistic. There's just way too much thinking in the future tense, like I will do this and I will do that. And I never had any interest in it, really. The first time I read it, when I was a junior monk, it just did not strike any chord with me at all. It just seemed like not a very good way of explaining how to meditate. But people have been asking me questions about these 16 steps, and in fact, I'm going to get another one on the scroll, I noticed when I was getting the questions together earlier today. But anyways, Don Fade says, with regard to the 16 steps, I interpret them to be not so much steps to a final goal, but more like different dishes at a buffet, each one being different energy that has a unique dynamic aspect or flavor of insight that can be cultivated while focusing on the breath. Maybe I'm completely missing the point, but heck, it works for me. Thoughts? And yeah, I think that is more correct. It's not really 16 stages or 16 steps, in perfecting mindfulness of breathing. It's just like 16 different ways of practicing it, with some of those ways, like at the very beginning, when you're just being mindful of breathing, being really what most people are practicing, and that is with good reason, I think. So yeah, that probably is a better way of interpreting it, that it's not 16 things that you're supposed to master in sequence. It's just 16 possible different things you can do when practicing mindfulness of breathing. But even then, the way they describe it with I will do this and I will do that is not a good way of meditating. that you should be thinking as little as possible, and you should be in the present moment, not thinking about what you're going to be mastering in the future, like some of these steps have in the text. So yeah, I think I would agree with Don Fades, and it might be different teachers, not necessarily even the Buddha, who had these different ways of practicing mindfulness of breathing that kind of got collated into this one list of different ways of doing it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, my questions for your next Q&A are about the Jewish Khazar theory, which speculates that 90% of Jews today are not descended from the Semitic Hebrews of the Bible that trace their bloodline to Abraham, or even come from the Middle East at all. Instead, according to this theory, the Ashkenazi Jews of today are descendants of the Khazars, a semi-nomadic pagan Asiatic tribe who built a kingdom in the area of southern Russia and converted to Judaism en masse in the 8th century. The proponents of this theory include Jewish authors like Shlomo Sand, with his book The Invention of the Jewish People, and Arthur Kessler, who in his book The 13th Tribe. Have you ever heard of the Jewish Khazar theory? And yeah, I've heard of it. They were like Huns or Mongols or Turks. You know, they were one of those Asiatic nomadic tribes from the steppes of Central Asia who were kept like migrating westwards in a lot of cases just to get away from even worse tribes farther east. They're migrating westwards and like attacking first the Roman Empire and then later, the European kingdoms and so forth that existed in medieval Europe. And they're particularly nasty. I mean, all of them were these nomadic Asiatic tribes. I mean, they were just from the steppes. I mean, they were just like ruthlessly just lacking in any kind of empathy or anything like that. I mean, they would just commit atrocities. That was sort of like the national pastime, was committing atrocities on other people. So it is true that the Khazars, who had this little kingdom going in Eastern Europe, that they converted to Judaism. Although I think they could test that now with DNA testing. You know, they've got like the different, what are they called? Not alleles. I always forget that. Well, these different haplogroups, they could probably figure it out pretty easily, testing the Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, just today I came across another theory about the origin of the Ashkenazi Jews, that it was they largely began with Greeks in Anatolia. So the Greeks, they colonized much of the world, especially after Alexander the Great conquered much of the world. And so Anatolia, which is like the Asian part of Turkey, was mostly Greek speaking, throughout like most of the Roman Empire and all that. And that a lot of them were converting to Judaism. In fact, a lot of the first European Christians were these same kind of Greeks that weren't satisfied with polytheism. They liked the idea of, for whatever reason, of, what Judaism was teaching at the time. And so you had a lot of converts, like Greek converts to Judaism. And another theory of the origin of the Ashkenazi Jews is that more of them came from these Greeks that became Jewish. And then a lot of them, when Christianity came along, a lot of those sort of Greeks that liked Judaism, maybe they were or maybe they weren't like circumcised and following Torah perfectly. I mean, it was Saint Paul of Tarsus. I mean, he was really converting lots and lots of these Greeks that were already interested in Judaism. So, and that's another theory, which again, and they know, DNA well enough now that they could probably verify some of this. And I would guess there isn't just one source of the ancient Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, there really was a diaspora of Jews, like the Roman Empire First you had the Babylonian captivity, then a lot of the Jews came back. A lot of them were even still there in the Holy Land, in, Palestine or Judea or whatever you want to call it. And then they just kept uprising against the Romans, so that there were a few anti-Jewish wars where they were putting down these rebellions. And I think it was Hadrian who had Jerusalem sacked, and Jews were not allowed to live there. And I mean, it was, again, they were just having to scatter. They had to live somewhere else. And so you had like large Jewish communities in Italy and, Southern Europe and so forth. And so I have no doubt that some Ashkenazi Jews really did come from these like displaced Jews of the diaspora. And then some of them probably came from the Khazars. Some of them came from these Greeks that converted to Judaism, like in, like Hellenistic times and early Roman times. And, who knows? There's probably others. So what would be the main group of, the main ancestor of Ashkenazi Jews? Well, the main ancestor of Ashkenazi Jews weren't Jewish at all. They were just Europeans that intermarried with Jews. So, yeah, I think the modern Ashkenazi Jew is way below 50% Hebrew in ancestry. You've got blonde, blue-eyed Jews nowadays. So, like Scarlett Johansson is Jewish. I think she was born that way. Not like Elizabeth Taylor, who just married into it, or Ivanka Trump, who married into it. I think she was born that way. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really no authority on, the ancestry of Ashkenazi Jews. I would guess that it's from a number of sources, like I was discussing. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is also from Romeo, which I think I've already answered because it was just sort of a follow-up to the first question. How plausible do I think this Kazar theory is? Yeah, so I already answered that part. And then he has in parentheses here, as much as I'd like you to answer these questions, I understand if you avoid doing so due to the possibly controversial nature of them. And really, I don't think that even very many Jews would object to what I just said. So, yeah, I think I already answered those questions. So I'm just moving on to the next one, which is from Cleefy. And I'm checking, and yep, we are recording. In fact, we've been recording for more than 30 minutes already. And Cleefy says, you kind of answered the question that I asked a few weeks ago about so-called assisted dying that is becoming a norm in the West. What is your opinion about it from a Buddhist point of view? Well, from a Buddhist point of view, to choose to die, like to choose, well, maybe I shouldn't even, I mean, this question may be more controversial and upsetting to people than the origin of the Ashkenazi Jews. Because it contains, you can easily say a certain word that you're not supposed to say on YouTube. It's certain words you're not supposed to say for various reasons. So anyways, euthanasia, assisted self-termination. It's the person who wants to auto-terminate, they have that right from the Buddhist point of view. It's not entirely moral, but it's not considered to be anything horrible. It's sort of like I said in the earlier Q&A that Cleefy is probably referring to. The whole idea that auto-termination is like very immoral comes mainly from Christianity. In pre-Christian paganism, everyone had that right. Sometimes it was your duty to auto-terminate. If you were a soldier who disgraced the legion, it was your duty to fall on your sword, for example. A lot of famous Romans did this. And not necessarily fell on their sword. I guess Mark Antony fell on his sword and he messed it up. He didn't fall on his sword right, and it took him a long time to die. But from the Buddhist point of view, the problematic part is the people that are helping. Like someone wants to end their life, then that is their decision to make. But anyone who helps them is, from a Buddhist point of view, participating in murder. Like you just help somebody to off themselves, don't want to use disrespectful language, but you help them in this process, then you are, from a Buddhist ethical point of view, a kind of murderer. And that applies also to abortions. From the Orthodox Theravadan point of view, that's also murder. And so helping someone, or like, especially if you talk them into it, it's like, well, this is a terminal condition. You're not going to get better. It's going to get more and more icky as time goes by. Maybe you ought to consider this option. Then that person, from a Buddhist ethical point of view, is a murderer if the person takes their advice. So it's really, you got to be really careful, because sometimes I can agree that euthanasia, like, let's say an animal. For example, one time, more than once, when I was a kid, my father would shoot some animal. We had a kitten that got up into a car. When he started the car, the fan belt just kind of chopped it up, and it was kind of maimed and kind of crawling away. My father went and got the gun and shot it. Also, we had this really nice collie dog that apparently got hit by a car. He disappeared for a few days, and when he came back, it's like all the skin on his side was missing, and my father just went in and got the gun and shot him and buried him out in the garden. And it just kind of makes sense that sometimes it's going to cause less suffering. But if you're doing it to somebody else, to some other sentient being, still you're messing with their karma. You are responsible for terminating their karmic stream in this life. And so you're making big karma by doing it. From a Buddhist point of view, even though, like, from a utilitarian Western ethical point of view, it may be the lesser of two evils. It may be, well-intentioned. You've got motivations of like sympathy or empathy, compassion. Still, from the Buddhist point of view, ancient Indian ethics, messing with somebody else's life and ending some other being's life is about the biggest, worst karma you can do. So, with regard to that sort of thing, the doctors and nurses especially would have to be more careful than the person who's making the decision, because, they pretty much have a right over their own life because it's their life. But even to help them is, in a sense, committing murder and in creating big karma, and not good karma either. So, we in the West, who are eclectic and somewhat lukewarm in our Buddhism, we can just kind of weigh the pros and cons and decide which way we're going to go. But still, I would advise just being very careful, especially if it's like your parent. Then, if it were my parent, I'd let them make the decision, and I wasn't gonna help them, really. I wouldn't want to. My father, my father was a tough guy. He wasn't really afraid of death. If he wanted me to help him, that would cause like a new, like, internal sort of debate in my mind as to whether I should help or not. I certainly wouldn't want to. From the Buddhist point of view, one of the things you can do that's guarantee you of going to hell is to deliberately cause the death of one of your parents. Although generally they're thinking more along the lines of Lizzie Borden and not along the lines of just unplugging the machine that's keeping them alive because their body is too broken and wasted to keep itself alive. So let's see here. I've noticed that I say "so" a lot in these Q&As. I hope it really doesn't bother people all that much. The more I get aware of it, the more I'm going to have like this automatic, like a reflex of catching it. Like I used to say, what was it? Basically. A lot. A lot of people will just throw basically. They'll just pepper their sentences with basically. And then I had a friend of mine just point out as an observation, basically doesn't really mean anything. And then it just kind of humbled me to think that I was just sort of peppering sentences with basically without being fully mindful of the fact that I was using this word so much. So anyways, I hope I answered it better this time, but I've got lots of questions to answer still. This could be a 3-hour long one. Those of you who like the Joe Rogan podcasts, you may not be intimidated by that. Some people are scared off by 3-hour long videos, especially if there's no like explosions and space aliens and nudity and that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to move on to Cleefy's second question. In my meditation, sometimes I reach the state of stillness where I almost stop thinking and only observe my breath. Where do I go from there? Do I stay in that stillness, or do I do something else? Let's say I dissolve into a light and build my body back. Well, you shouldn't do anything deliberately. If you're trying to get into deep meditation, the less thinking, the less effort, the better. It's kind of counterintuitive or ironic or paradoxical maybe that the better your meditation gets, the more effortless it gets, until finally when you become fully enlightened or you get into the deepest possible meditative states, it's just effortless. So you get into a state of stillness where you almost stop thinking and only observe your breath. Well, I mean, you haven't completely stopped thinking yet, so you can still work on that. And observing your breath, it depends on how you're doing it. I mean, the less effort, the less watching and the more just plain seeing there is, the better. See, watching is like a deliberate act that involves a certain amount of volition and perception and so forth. But just seeing is more detached than watching. It's like just hearing is more detached from listening. So it's better to hear and see. The wiser you get, the more hearing and seeing you're going to do, and the less listening and watching you're going to do. The less listening and observing. So, yeah, I mean, if you get it perfect, then you're gonna have fourth jhana, because mindfulness of breathing goes all the way up to fourth jhana. So if you can perfect that mindfulness of breathing, then you've got fourth jhana. You've got as high as you can get. So, I mean, if you're just kind of stagnating, you're not making any progress, you might want to try other things. If you just keep trying and trying and trying for years and you're not making improvement, then it does make sense that you can experiment with something else. But at first, I mean, I don't really know what your progress has been like. So I would say just keep doing mindfulness of breathing unless you're just stagnating and not making progress, and then try something different. But it isn't really a progression of you get the mindfulness of breathing down so that you almost or completely stop thinking. You're only observing the breath, and then you start like trying to dissolve into light or doing any kind of psychic stuff. Yeah, that's like a step backwards. The less stuff you got going on, the better, because you're trying to get as close to a flat calm as you can in your mind so that you're not distracted by the waves, and then you can see, essentially the water as the water. You can just get through all the samsaric phenomena, which are mainly just appearances, and just get through to the reality underneath. So the less stuff you got going on, the better, unless you just got a busy mind. You need busy stuff going on just to keep your mind like occupied. Because if you've got a busy mind and you're trying some kind of very still, quiet meditation, your mind's just going to overflow the primary object and just be wandering all over the place. So I hope there was some useful advice in that long rambling monologue, because I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, how advisable is it for a renunciant to send metta? Presumably, metta would ordinarily generate good karma, but a serious renunciant is trying to minimize all karma. Well, according to Theravada Buddhism, even just like getting jhana, where you're in these deep meditative states, that's good karma too. I mean, you get into Brahma realms only through attaining jhana, according to Buddhism, at least Theravada Buddhism. So a certain amount of good karma is unavoidable. You're just going to have to deal with it, which, I mean, good karma, I mean, it can cause distractions, it can cause, all kinds of, really pleasant stuff to come your way, but you can just kind of neutralize the effects of that by just guarding the sense doors, being mindful and so forth. But I mean, the Buddha in the texts advises monks to radiate metta, to beam metta, to broadcast metta. And really, I mean, the less attached you are to it, the more it is that you're just being mindful of what you're doing, then in a way, you're sort of transcending the karmic effect of it anyway. You're detaching from the metta because you're doing it mindfully. It's just like energy transfer or something, just this phenomenon going on, so that in a way you're detached from it. It's sort of like the Diamond Cutter Sutra, which is a Mahayana text. It talks about the proper conduct of a bodhisattva. And it's like the proper conduct of a bodhisattva is to do only good, while at the same time not really thinking of it as good. You're just detached from it. You don't care about the outcome. You're just doing it because that is what you do. Which reminds me of the Bhagavad Gita also, where, it's like the fruit of your actions, you just offer up to God. It's a kind of detachment. So you're doing good, but you're not attached to the good. You don't have that kind of karma. It's just more of a spiritual, wholesome karma that's going to help you to practice spiritually in the future. So I'm just going to move on to Indiana Dhamma's second question. In Orthodox Theravada, is it mandatory to take a refuge before an ordained monk in order for it to be official? Oh, so no, it's not really necessary. A lot of Burmese people think that if you take 3 refuges, Dhamma, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, or 5 precepts or 8 precepts, it doesn't really count. It's like unofficial if you don't do it in front of a monk, or at the very least, do it in front of the Buddha at an altar. You do it in front of the Buddha statue or something. But I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's like, it's more internal than just an external ritual anyway. Like keeping 5 precepts, I mean, the actual ritual of taking the 5 precepts is almost irrelevant. What's way more important is that you actually follow the 5 precepts. You might not ever, do the Pali recitation of undertaking these 5 precepts. And it's the same way with the 3 refuges. I mean, so long as you sincerely take refuge, then you've taken the refuge, regardless of what you say or don't say, or any rituals, or whoever, whether you do it in front of a monk or anybody else or nobody. But a lot of mainstream, like Asian type Theravada, think that really it's better to do it in front of a monk, or at least, like I said, do it in front of a Buddha statue at an altar. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, what is the best argument you can think of for why an alcoholic should quit drinking here and now? Well, from a Buddhist point of view, second noble truth, clinging and attachment, craving and attachment are the cause of all suffering. So alcoholism is a kind of addiction, ethanol addiction. Addiction involves craving and attachment. So alcohol addiction is a cause of suffering. So if you don't want to suffer, you should try to overcome that particular addiction, or any addiction really. Best not to be addicted to anything. So that's the best, especially the best Buddhist argument for why an alcoholic should quit drinking, because craving and attachment are the cause of all suffering, according to the Buddha's, the second noble truth of Buddhism. So, since alcohol addiction is a cause of great craving and attachment, then it is the cause of great suffering. And if you don't want to suffer, most people don't want to suffer very much. Most people would like to keep their suffering to a minimum as a general rule. That it just makes sense. It's just a sensible thing. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liber-Lam's second question, which is, could it be argued that there are sentient beings in the Lokudra, which Lokudra is literally, Loka is world or cosmos, and Udra means beyond or higher than. So could it be argued that there are sentient beings that are higher than the cosmos? Or, I mean, definitely there are sentient beings higher than this world. You know, you got all the heaven realms and all that. Now, this not even bringing up space aliens. But, I mean, beyond any world. I mean, you got the formless realms. The formless realms could be called Lokodara. But, I mean, if you mean beyond samsara, beyond the 31 planes of existence, then it could be argued, I mean, anything could be argued, but it wouldn't be Orthodox Buddhism. So, I mean, it sort of reminds me of the answer to an earlier question where it's like, what is it? Why is it that an enlightened being stops being reborn? I mean, they don't necessarily, I mean, you can't even really put it into words. It's not them getting reborn anymore because the them has been neutralized. So, sentient beings in the Lokodara. I mean, there are a lot of people, including a lot of Buddhists, who think that Buddhas just continue to be reborn, or enlightened beings continue to be reborn. But it's in a different way where it's like there's nobody there, and it's just sort of they're appearing as phenomena to other unenlightened beings that they really don't have even any belief in a self anymore. They don't have an ego anymore, or any kind of, you know, it's like what was keeping them, you know, sort of existing as an entity no longer exists. But I mean, you get into these realms of just paradox, and the mind can't grasp these mind warpy stuff. When you're trying to think about, you know, it's like an enlightened being, you know, they transcend this body. There's this karmic stream, and just let it go where it wants. While, you know, they have just merged with the absolute or some such, or just ceased, blown out like a flame. And then, you know, what happens to that karmic stream? According to Orthodox Buddhism, it just gets cut off. Orthodox Buddhism is very mechanistic in its description of certain things. And so it might be that Orthodox Theravada Buddhism is not 100% correct, and it could be that there is some semblance anyway of like the transcended karmic stream of an enlightened being still like manifesting in this universe with nobody there. It's just like the karma of other beings are helping it to manifest, which it doesn't make sense to even talk about it. So maybe I should just move on to the next question. This is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, very sorry to hear about the issue with your employer. Since this is a common misfortune in a lot of folks' lives, I think most people have been fired or let go at some time. On that note, most people also attribute something like this to bad or past karma, i.e. maybe they fired someone without good cause in a past life. Personally, I think karma is infinitely more complicated than that, but can you share your thoughts in regard to the karma aspect of losing your job? Well, I mean, it certainly was co-created. I was getting increasingly frustrated and annoyed with the just flat out incompetence of upper management. And so I was becoming more just fed up and disgusted in my communications with upper management, which is not diplomatic. So, I mean, even if I hadn't gotten angry in the final interview where they're telling me do this, and I was telling them it's just not realistic to do this, they're saying do it, and I just say no. And whether I'd gotten angry or not at that point, I probably wouldn't be working there anyway. But I did get angry. I was getting too just agitated and just impatient with these people to even try to be polite anymore. So that was on me. Although, with regard to how the situation arose leading up to that, who knows? I mean, there's infinite complexity in karma. There's no telling what it was exactly. It could have been like 100 different things, all just sort of kind of weaving together to make this incident occur. And there's no way. I mean, the Buddha says even trying to understand karma can cause you to go insane. Just all the ramifications of it and the subtleties and complexities of it. So it's really hard to say exactly what brought about that. I mean, it'd be my own mental states ultimately, because karma is a mental state. But then again, enlightened beings, Mahamoggallana, as I keep saying, according to tradition, was literally beaten to a pulp. Even though he was a fully enlightened being, he was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples. So, I mean, even the Buddha had, Devadatta trying to kill him and so forth. So you still can have bad karma, and there's no telling what resulted in me working for a company that just had this utterly incompetent attitude with regard to hiring people. So I have no idea, but really, I don't score high marks on unquestioning obedience. I just never have. I've never been good at unquestioning obedience. And when you've got somebody who's stupider than you and obviously incompetent ordering you to do something that's just ridiculous, then I'm just not going to do it. I mean, it would depend on the circumstances, but in this circumstance, it was the camel's back was already broken. I was just fed up, and so I just flat out refused. And so I'm looking for another job. I think I might, the place where I used to work would hire me no problem, but I'd rather not take a major pay cut in order to go back to work. And so I'm checking out my options at present. And there's a chance I might get sort of like an afternoon shift, like working until like 11 p.m., which would be better for my woman and me, because as I was saying at the beginning of this thing, we are night people anyway. We're really not morning people. So I think I'll just move on to the Arya Swasti Project's second question, which is, do you think that it happened in order to clear room for something more suitable for you? That's possible too, because sometimes even a spiritually advanced person can have bad things happen to them just because it's time for a change. It's like, they need something bad to happen to them for whatever reason. Like in a previous Q&A, I think it was maybe 2 Q&As ago, I was talking about the childhood of St. John of the Cross. He had a horrible childhood. I mean, just abuse, starvation, like having to work in a plague hospital as a kid. All this kind of horrible stuff was going on as a kid, but it just was like a crucible that just sort of cooked him into being a saint. And that can happen. I mean, near-death experiences have caused people to have awakening experiences also. So just because something seems to be a bad thing happening to you, in a lot of cases, it's really not that bad. Like Ram Dass, back when he was Dr. Richard Alpert, he was a Harvard professor. He got fired from Harvard, which was considered to be just a total disgrace, but it just opened up his path to going to India and meeting Neem Karoli Baba and becoming a relatively advanced spiritual teacher. So we'll just have to wait and see with regard to what the results of this entire situation are going to be. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is there anything that we can do or need us to do, like purchasing your books or a Subscribe Star, to help the situation? Sadhu. Well, that's a generous kind of question to ask. And I mean, you can buy my books on Amazon, if you please. The links are below, as usual. And also, I do have a Subscribe Star. There's other ways of donating to the cause if you see fit. And then it is a meritorious deed, although we're not exactly starving. I mean, it is nice to have help at times like this, But I mean, I'm doing this for free. I'm not doing it to get paid or anything. So just a kind of public service. And I mean, we're not really hurting right now. We do have money in the bank right now. Not like a whole lot of money, but we do have money in the bank. So I appreciate that sort of indirect kind of offer. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Toronto Nat. And Toronto Nat says, is it fair to consider President Trump a bodhisattva at this point? And he asked this question on the Discord server, and I gave this sort of joke answer. I said, maybe a demigod, and possibly to be declared a god by the Senate after his demise. And then Toronto Nat maybe took me seriously, because he said, will you go into more detail about this in the Q&A? So here we are. So Toronto Nat wants to know if President Trump is a bodhisattva. And I mean, in this life, he's no doubt unaware of being a bodhisattva. He's really not a particularly spiritually oriented person as far as I can tell. I mean, he's more the heroic kind of person. I mean, he is kind of a Julius Caesar type person, which is why I made kind of the joke about he might be declared a god by the Senate after his demise. It was like back in pagan Rome, you know, after a good emperor died, he could be declared a god by the Senate. And then he'd be considered a god, and there'd be like temples or shrines or whatever set up in his honor. But if he was a bad emperor, they would say, no, he's not a god, and they'd just throw his body into the Tiber River. So a demigod, yeah, I don't think he's a demigod, because I'm pretty sure both of his parents are human. But I mean, he does have a kind of heroic character to him, which a lot of leftists and a lot of sneering black-pilled, I don't know what they would be, libertarians or you know, like super right-wingers or something, they might just sneer at that. But I mean, he is kind of like a Julius Caesar figure. And luckily, his previous practice of forgiving his political enemies and putting them in positions of trust, which backfired on Caesar totally at the end, it kind of backfired on Trump in his first term, but he survived it. But yeah, I think President Trump has the potential of just going scorched earth and just really going for it. And I'm sure that most of his supporters are going to be cheering him on enthusiastically if he does this. You know, like just like gutting the federal bureaucracy, for example, deporting the illegal aliens, that kind of thing. Getting the hostages back, which for some reason during the Biden administration, the fact that we still have American citizens held hostage in Asia by Hamas, and I think also in Afghanistan after all this time. I mean, it's like you don't see it in the news at all. Nobody gives a shit. But I do think that President Trump does give a shit about this kind of stuff. So he's kind of a heroic figure, and it's like totally unheroic people hate and resent him just maniacally. You know, because nowadays on the left, to be heroic is to be sort of like a moral degenerate who flaunts their degeneracy. That's like brave for them. But I mean, if you're like heroic in the ancient sense, that's toxic masculinity at the very least. So, yeah, I think he might have to really declare himself dictator for life, or get himself declared dictator for life by Congress, and then after he dies, maybe they will declare him a small g god. But I kind of doubt it. I really don't think so. I don't even think he'd really want that anyway. He would not want to be the Julius Caesar of America, even though he kind of is sort of to some degree. But Julius Caesar, I mean, while I'm digressing on ancient history, the Roman Republic was in a much worse state than the American Republic is now. That there were just continual bloody civil wars going back and forth, just continual purges. Whoever got into power would just purge their political enemies. Then, you know, you'd have some survivor among the political enemies who rises to power somehow and just starts purging the other side. There was a very big turnover rate in the Senate in those days, and it was just Rome was sort of degenerating into chaos, political and social chaos. And Julius Caesar, by having himself declared dictator for life and sort of setting the groundwork for the empire, the end of the Republic and the beginning of the empire, he really did kind of push reset on Rome and got it going for several more centuries. But I don't think it's really necessary for Donald Trump to even try anything like this. And besides, he's an 80-year-old man. Maybe one of his sons can carry on the legacy or something, if necessary. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Cherzaskazes. And Cherzaskazes says, do you hold view that a person cannot do anything to become enlightened? If yes, why the Four Noble Truths says that there is a way to enlightenment and it involves things like right action and right livelihood, therefore it's doing something. Well, it's sort of like Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti used to say, is that you can open the window, but you can't make the breeze blow in. That you can get yourself ready for enlightenment, but you can't make it happen. So even like in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the Buddha says, if you practice this diligently for, the X period of time, two things are guaranteed. You'll either become enlightened or you'll get really close to being enlightened. And you can't guarantee that you're going to be enlightened because there's no way to make it happen. So it's like you open the window, but whether the breeze blows in or not is beyond your control. But I mean, it's not going to blow in if you don't open the window. So the practice is to get you as receptive as possible to the moment of enlightenment. And you can't guarantee that it's going to happen. You can't force it to happen. But still, you can increase your odds and, you can just be ready for it. You can be receptive for it to happen. And part of that is, clean your room, open the window, and then maybe the breeze will blow in. Sooner or later, if you keep the window open long enough, it's very likely to blow in. So, yeah, the Noble Eightfold Path, it is the path leading to enlightenment, but it doesn't make enlightenment happen. It just makes you ready for it. And then, God willing, it'll happen. But it's sort of devolves onto something akin to divine grace, because you really do not have control over that. There's nothing you can do because doing is karma, and nibbana is not the result of any kind of cause. This karma leads to more karma. It does not lead to the cessation of karma. So I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskazes' second question, which is, if a layperson is to follow 5 precepts, Anagarika 8, Novice 10, and a Bhikkhu 227 plus thousand more, then wouldn't it be better for one's karma or kama and convenience to just keep the 8 precepts and keeping them well and keeping them well and strict and not ordain as a monk and break lots of rules? Well, it can be. I mean, if you just keep 8 precepts, but I mean, it's the whole lifestyle of the monk is more conducive to enlightenment than the lifestyle of, say, somebody living in a house with a family and a TV set and bills to pay and, a job and insurance and all this kind of stuff. It's like the radical, solitude and austerity of the monk's life is really, it's that more than following all those rules that makes the monk's life more conducive to spiritual advancement, the cultivation of wisdom, and ultimately enlightenment. So, yeah, some people, they would just prefer to be a novice, dress in monk's robes, live the monk's life, but then you've only got 10 rules plus the Sakya rules, which are kind of minor rules of etiquette that a novice still has to follow, a samanera. That, in a way that could be in certain ways more conducive to enlightenment, partly because in a place like Burma, you would have much lower prestige than a fully ordained monk. You'd have less people coming to visit you and pestering you and wanting to talk with you all the time, that sort of thing. But mainly it's the lifestyle more than the number of rules that really determines whether it's a spiritual life that is conducive to spiritual advancement. So I think I'll just move on to the third question of Cherzaska's, which is, why become a monk in 21st century? Is it a social status thing, paradoxically? And again, it's like the lifestyle. And in the West, becoming a monk in the 21st century is somewhat problematic because you can't really live the lifestyle of a monk that is described in the text, who's just wandering around, going into the village for alms, like sleeping under a tree, that kind of thing. It doesn't work nearly as easily in the West, mainly because early Indian Buddhism was designed for early India, not for 21st century America or Europe or wherever. So, to become a monk in the 21st century in like Burma or Thailand or Sri Lanka, that's one thing. Becoming a monk in the West, where you're living in like a house in the suburbs, it's got maybe a little monastery sign out front, not too big because they don't want to attract trouble or anything, and then you've got all these payments, bills and stuff with regard to this house, and maybe you'll have a committee of lay people that are paying the bills. Monks aren't supposed to handle money, and then you've got to like defer to this group of lay people and their ideas about how the monastery should be run, and it's just not the same kind of lifestyle as is described in the suttas, in the Pali text. If you really want to live that kind of lifestyle, your best bet is to go to a Theravada Buddhist country and try to follow that lifestyle as well as you can in a climate and in a society that really supports that sort of thing, rather than in the West where it's supported by some people and just sort of ignored by most people, and maybe antagonistic for some people. And you got all these complications of living a worldly samsaric kind of a life, and you can't really just cut your ties with society and just become a nameless wandering beggar, which is what the early monks were. You just wandered from place to place. It might be that nobody knew what your name was. You didn't have a name hardly. Just sleep in a different place every night. You don't know where your next meal's coming from, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's conceivable that you could do that in the West, but the West just isn't designed for that sort of thing. So, if you want to increase your odds of becoming enlightened, then yeah, becoming a monk makes sense. And it's probably makes even more sense to become a monk in a Buddhist culture rather than in a non-Buddhist culture. But, it depends on the individual. For some people, the monk's life they're just not meant to be a monk. They just do not have the temperament that is suitable for being a monk. You don't like looking at bare walls in solitude and silence day after day for the rest of your life, then being a monk may not be for you. If you just can't stand being celibate for the rest of your life, then certainly being a monk is not going to be the right choice for you. It's not for everybody. And for some people, it might be an obstacle. If you're so frustrated, you're going so much against your own nature by being a monk that it's just tying you in knots. You're just like this neurotic mess and sexually frustrated besides, then yeah, you might be better off trying to, strive for enlightenment in some other way and just following some other lifestyle. But it should be simple and harmless. It's just avoiding trouble as a general rule, unless you're really an advanced tantric practitioner or some such. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And Skoladin or Skuladin says, what are some of the ways that people have tried to cheese themselves into a heaven realm? And I'm not exactly sure what it means to cheese yourself into a heaven realm. And then he's got the bullet point, the characteristic bullet point. I don't suppose people tried voting. So, yeah, it doesn't help me to understand the question. So people have tried to cheese themselves into a heaven realm. Does that mean just kind of like, I don't know, doing some kind of slick deal to get into heaven? And I mean, that just reminds me of the Burmese belief that if you build a pagoda, I mean, that's pretty much it. You're pretty much guaranteed to heaven. That's the stairway to heaven right there. It was like George Orwell, who is much more famous for his novels Animal Farm and 1984. He also wrote a novel called Burmese Days because George Orwell lived in Burma as a colonial police officer during the British times in central Burma. And he wrote this novel about what it was like in colonial Burma during the British Raj. And the villain of the story was U Po Chin, who was this Burmese guy, just completely corrupt. And his wife would warn him sometimes, you know, you are an evil man, you're going to go to hell. And U Po Chin would just say, you don't know anything. I'm going to build a pagoda. And it's like, he just thinks that building a pagoda would just like erase all of his past misdeeds, just erase his bad karma or something. But aside from that, I'm not sure what cheesing yourself into a heaven realm, I'm not even sure exactly what that means. Trying to cheese themselves into a heaven realm. So if it doesn't mean some kind of slick deal where you can get in without technically being worthy of it, then I'm not sure. But in Asia, especially in like Buddhist Asia, there are a lot of spiritual materialists who just consider merit to be a kind of spiritual money, and they just do meritorious deeds as a way of buying their way into heaven. And if you just do the meritorious deeds without caring about heaven, just because that's what you do, I mean, it's going to be much more meritorious overall than you got this kind of transaction going. You know, I'm going to do this in order to get that. You know, it's just becomes sort of like a business transaction. But I do not fully understand Scoladin or Scoladine's question, and so I'm moving on to the next one. And I would advise people to try to be articulate in your question so that it's clear that someone other than you, if they read it, they'll understand what it means. Just always try to imagine this. I do this when I write. I don't write very much anymore because I'm usually doing videos like this. But when you write something, you know, try to imagine somebody other than you reading it, you know, who doesn't have the same inside knowledge you've got and, you know, doesn't have the same vocabulary as you, same working vocabulary anyway. So anyways, Scoladin's next question. Has anyone made it all the way to the highest heaven realm and formed a harem from Mara's 3 voluptuous daughters? And if anyone has done that, I do not think it has been recorded. It's not recorded in the Buddhist texts, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah, I mean, you seduce Mara's 3 daughters, you might have Mara to contend with. You might get pissed off at that. Or who knows, maybe he'll like you for being a rascal. But yeah, I mean, total hypothetical there. No way of knowing such an answer. It is not recorded anywhere in the text that I have ever seen. And I rather doubt it. So I'm just going to move on to the Scoladin's third question, which is as follows. Has anyone claimed full disclosure from meditation? And then in the bullet points, he has something like, aliens exist, they're our greatest allies, the world is bankrupt, so you're now their slaves, I just reached enlightenment, so bye. Well, this is another somewhat ambiguous question. Has anyone claimed full disclosure for meditation? And with regard to like this, I just reached enlightenment, I'm sure there have been lots of people who have claimed full disclosure on that one. You know, the Buddha himself apparently made the full disclosure of his enlightenment after meditation. And in the Pali Suttas, you're going to find lots and lots of people doing likewise. With regard to somebody through meditation, I would assume that people through meditation may have come through with disclosures that there are like small g gods, there are like entities in other dimensions and so forth, kind of like from an ayahuasca trip or something. Sometimes meditation can be somewhat psychedelic for some people. I'm sure that people have had all kinds of weird insights, including like worldly, political kind of insights and so forth through meditation. The only ones that really matter from the traditional Buddhist point of view are these reaching enlightenment or reaching one of the stages of Aryahood, or getting one of the Vipassana insight knowledges. There's this list, I think it's 10 Vipassana insight knowledges that you're supposed to get. Like the Mahasi method, a lot of people don't realize this, but the Mahasi method is largely based on just doing mindfulness of breathing until these Vipassana insight knowledges start arising in order. And then the teacher, if you get the right one in the right order, he'll write it down. He'll make like a harumping noise and write it down, and then that'll sort of give you positive feedback to move on to the next one or some such. So maybe I answered one of Skuladin's 3 questions there, which I guess is good enough. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Virgil. And this is kind of an interesting question. I don't think anyone's asked this one before. And it's about meditation. He says, what does it mean to change postures mindfully? Does that mean you keep awareness of the meditation object while you adjust or change your posture, like switching your legs? Or it means to be mindful of the process itself by focusing on the body and the process of changing legs? Does it mean you keep awareness of the meditation? Oh, okay. All right. I think in Mahasi, they say to be aware of the feelings while changing and noting everything, but that may not apply to samatha type practices like metta or anapanasati, where you need to stay with the object. Yeah, that would be my answer, is it depends on what kind of meditation you're doing. If you're doing mindfulness meditation, then you're supposed to be mindful of whatever is like foremost in your mind, whatever is like the most noticeable stimulus is what you're supposed to be mindful of. So let's say you're sitting in meditation, you're doing mindfulness like satipatthana meditation, and which would include mindfulness of breathing. You can do mindfulness of breathing as a mindfulness meditation, which is like what Mahasi teaches. And you're going to notice like your knee hurts, and then it just keeps hurting until finally you get to a point where you're no longer meditating on your breath, you're meditating on the screaming pain in your knee. And that can go on for a long time. And maybe, it used to be in Mahasi, they would teach you, even if it hurts so bad you think you're going to die, don't change position. It's called heroic effort. Pain is the key that unlocks the door to Nibbana. Pain is the friend of the meditator. They used to teach that back when people were tougher, I guess. So, you notice the pain in your knee for a while, and then you notice like continued urges to change the position of your knee. Then maybe you notice the decision, I think I better change position in my legs because my knee is hurting like a son of a bitch. And then you got to notice the intention to move your arm and to like lift your leg, and then you're noticing that the screaming pain is your sore joint is like being moved, and then you're being aware of the pressure of your hand against your leg and the muscles in your arms and the whole rest. Everything that arises, you're supposed to be mindful of it and note it until finally you're back in regular position again. Maybe your knee doesn't hurt nearly so bad anymore, so you can go back to mindfulness of breathing. But if you're doing some kind of samatha, like concentration meditation, some samadhi-based meditation, then it may be like if you're doing mindfulness of, like light kasina or something, then you would still try to be focused on the light kasina while very sort of unobtrusively, just as casually and slowly and just sort of non-disruptively as possible, change your position. Although if you're doing a samatha really well, then probably you just sort of be detached from the pain anyway. So it does depend on whether you're doing like mindfulness-based meditation or like samadhi concentration-based meditation. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, please explain the karma generated in this case. And he left a link to a video, which was about a 10-year-old girl with emotional problems who stomped on the head of a baby and killed it. And the baby's father was unwilling to forgive her for that. So what is the karma generated in this case? Well, there's three main people involved, I guess. There's other people involved. First, you got the baby who died, and there's no telling what the baby's karma was that caused its life to be just abruptly ended at the age of about 6 months because of this 10-year-old girl stomping on his head. And then the 10-year-old girl, I mean, she was kind of a mess already, apparently, based on the video. And I mean, she's even more of a mess now because she's guilty of first-degree murder at 10 years old. So, I mean, she's got a mess of a life to contend with unless somehow, and let's hope that this happens, somehow she has some kind of breakthrough and makes some progress rather than just spending the rest of her life just this mess. With regard to the father, I mean, it's understandable. I mean, from like a saintly point of view, like the Orthodox Buddhist point of view, of course he should forgive the girl. You know, in Christianity, of course, you're supposed to forgive everybody. But I mean, it's understandable that he would want her to be punished for killing his baby, and that his reluctance or unwillingness to forgive her, in a way, I mean, he's making karma for himself through the anger and the hatred and the desire for vengeance. You know, maybe it's just justice that he wants, but still he's got a strong attachment, which is creating karma. And he's obviously not a happy man, and he's making bad karma for himself too. But in a situation like this, if you're not a saint already, I mean, somebody kills your baby, then, I mean, it may take quite a while before you cool down enough to just sort of get a little bit of detachment. It may be 2 years from now he's willing to forgive the girl. It's just that, you know, he's kind of caught up in just paternal instincts and anger and indignation and all that. But I mean, obviously the girl made worse karma by killing the baby than the father is making by not forgiving her for killing his baby. And with regard to the karma generated, I mean, others, you know, like the judge and, you know, the police officers involved and so on and so forth, who knows? So I'm just going to move on to Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana's next question, which is, you said you don't want me to ask more questions about the 16 steps. Were you being serious, or was that a joke? Because I genuinely had more questions about it. Well, I was serious. It's like 3 questions about these 16 steps. And there was another question about it in this Q&A. So that's 4 questions about these 16 steps, or 16 approaches to mindfulness of breathing. I mean, I've already said over and over again, it's just largely an academic thing for me. I really don't think the Buddha actually taught this. It could be that it was just a compilation of different like instructions with regard to mindfulness of breathing, that some of these instructions were put into very clumsy language, which makes it very obviously bad advice for a meditator. I mean, you'd have to reinterpret the instructions in order for it not to be bad advice. And it's just, I just never paid much attention to it. I read the sutta. I think it's in the Majjhima Nikaya. And I mean, it really did not strike a chord with me at all. It just seemed like it was not good meditation advice for me. Maybe someone else would really go for it. But for me, I don't know. So why Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana is so intrigued by this? I mean, you should ask somebody else. You should ask somebody who takes it more seriously, like a more orthodox kind of teacher, like, you know, any of the monks that do Q&As. You know, there are monks on YouTube that do Q&As, and they tend to be more orthodox than me. They'll take the Anapana Sutta more seriously than I do. And then they might be able to come up with, I mean, you could even look on the internet. There's at least one entire book written on that one sutta, which has like probably most, if not all, of the commentarial stuff translated too, and you could study that. I don't remember if it was Bhikkhu Bodhi, or I hope it wasn't Bhikkhu Bodhi, because he doesn't really meditate. But I mean, there's some famous monk from like the 1970s or 80s wrote this book about this sutta. You know, it's just in-depth explanation. And if you really want to know what the 16 steps entail and so on and so forth, et cetera, then yeah, I would suggest that you ask somebody else or try and find that book and study that book, or look online. I mean, it might be all online now. That what is the commentarial explanation for these 16 different steps or stages or approaches to mindfulness of breathing? Because I mean, why keep flogging a dead baby with this? I mean, no, I shouldn't have said that, because we just did one about a dead baby. So, yeah, I shouldn't have said that. Dead horse. Let's just go back to the horse. Man. And somebody thought that me talking about the ancestry of the Ashkenazi Jews was going to be controversial, something that people could complain about. But yeah, I mean, I'm no authority on these 16 steps. You're better off. I mean, if you're really that interested, you should probably ask somebody who takes it way more seriously than I do. And so I'm just going to move on to Siovakshin Sipat Zidana's next question. What is the difference between a democracy and a republic? Well, a democracy is the rule of the majority, whereas a republic generally has a constitution that helps to protect people from the rule of the majority. It can be a democratic republic, which is what America supposedly is, but still, I mean, like the stereotypical description of a democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding on what to have for dinner. So, I mean, the founding fathers of America realized that democracy can be that way. It can be mob rule, and it can be, the majority preying upon the minority. And so you set up a constitution that is going to protect the minority to some degree. So that would be my amateurish attempt at describing the difference between a democracy and a republic. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid has asked some very lengthy questions here. Very long questions asked by Zenithoid. The first one is the shortest of the three. He says, when Siddhartha Gautama was asked if he would exist after death, not exist after death, exist and not exist after death, or neither exist nor not exist after death, he rejected all possibilities. Here he is telling us that we can never understand the absolute through thought. However, if we are going to talk about the absolute in any way, we have to imperfectly shove it through the lens of one of the four possibilities. Which of the four do you think tarnishes the understanding of the absolute the least? Well, probably most Theravada Buddhists, including most Theravada scholar monks, would have to go with the second option, so that when a Tathagata after death does not exist. That would come closest to the truth, I think. So, I mean, your four options are: an enlightened being exists after death, doesn't exist after death, does and doesn't exist, and neither does nor does not exist after death. And, I mean, just going with like mainstream Buddhist philosophy, the second option comes closer to the truth, is he no longer exists. That's why early Buddhist iconography never showed Buddha images. They would show a footprint, they'd show an empty seat, they'd just show a Bodhi leaf or something to represent the Buddha, because he was no longer in this world. He was no longer in any world. So probably the one option of those four, which tarnishes Buddhist philosophy the least, would be that an enlightened being no longer exists after death. Although, I mean, that's kind of what we go with, although really it's beyond that. Even that is invalid, which then gives rise to these possibilities that I was mentioning earlier about how an enlightened being could still seem to exist after death, but you're getting into really paradoxical ground at that point. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And I'm still feeling a kind of sort of cringy semi-regret for that flogging a dead baby comment that I made earlier. Because, I mean, it was just too close to the story of a man who lost his baby, and then there could be a connection, and then no such connection was intended. So, Zenithoid's second question, and this is one of the long ones. A logical issue I've had with the achievability of Nibbana is that because it is without cause and does not cause anything else, it cannot interact with the causal and contingent, meaning that it cannot be achieved because it cannot be affected and is not within the realm of cause. However, the idea of God being the absolute also does not work, because in order for him to create or interact with his creation, he must have a causal or contingent aspect, meaning he is still within the realm of contingency and therefore not absolute. A scientific materialist might just say, well, then there is no absolute, but even through simple Aristotelian logic, this doesn't work, because this leads to essencelessness, Padicca Samuppada, which has components of infinite regress, therefore lacking any explanatory power or a grounding reality to base anything off. There is a divide among atheists as to whether or not existence had a beginning or is eternal, but these options fail because this would require a causeless beginning or an infinite regress, which are both illogical. It seems that Siddhartha Gautama was right in his claim that the absolute can never be properly understood through words. Going with pure Aristotelian logic, I don't think the absolute can be reached, but in the context of a meaningless and dysteleological samsara, where even death cannot certainly promise finality, it seems like the only thing worth trying to do, especially considering it seems likely that others, namely the Buddha, have done it in the past. How can I get my mind to shut up about trying to understand the absolute and get closer to just experiencing it as a layperson? I seriously doubt that lay people can become enlightened. It seems impossible to fully integrate the understanding of the absolute if you have to do things like trying to survive and constantly understanding everything through samsaric language instead of meditating 24/7. So I guess the question mark, the actual question is, how can I get my mind to shut up about trying to understand the absolute and get closer to just experiencing it as a layperson? Well, I mean, if you really believed that you can't understand it intellectually, which you can't, then, I mean, you wouldn't just keep trying to figure it out. It's like compulsive thinking, I guess. And I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, the thing to do is just be mindful of it. And when it starts to arise, just label it compulsive thinking and let it go. But apparently, you do not fully believe that you can't figure out the absolute because you keep trying. And if you really knew that you couldn't figure it out, you wouldn't keep trying. You know, it's like you might try to jump to the moon, 5 or 6 or 700 times. But eventually, you're going to have to realize that you just can't jump to the moon. There's no air up there anyway. So, I mean, once you fully realize that you can't jump to the moon, which most people fully realize, then that's why you don't see people trying to jump to the moon. You don't see very many people trying to do the impossible unless they just don't know that it's impossible yet. But once you know something's impossible, then as a general rule, you stop trying. I mean, you got to draw the line somewhere. If it's impossible, don't try to do it, especially if you're sure that it's impossible. So I think you haven't fully realized that you can't figure out the absolute, because thoughts are symbols, and symbols are very crude attempts at representing what they're trying to represent. And what these symbols are trying to represent in this case is completely formless. And how the mind cannot grasp that. It just can't. You cannot perceive something that is formless. You're going to have some kind of form to it You're gonna have to attribute some kind of form to it just for it to be like something that you can deal with in your mind. In order to call it an it. So, yeah, I mean, the best thing to do, I guess, is just be mindful. I mean, whenever you catch yourself trying to do this, instead of just like setting aside the claims that it's impossible because you don't fully believe them, just it's not going to work. You're never going to figure out ultimate reality. You cannot figure out ultimate reality symbolically because ultimate reality is not symbolic. Symbols are very different. Like the letters TREE are extremely different from an actual tree. And then when you're trying to figure out the ultimate truth, it's even more different. Like your attempts to understand ultimate reality are even more different than the letters TREE are from an actual tree. So it's just not going to work. And eventually you're going to have to just realize that, and then you'll just let it go. Once you have fully realized that you cannot figure out ultimate reality, then you'll just let it go. So, but until then, you should be mindful at least that you're trying to figure out reality again. You can even label it as that whenever it comes up, trying to figure out reality. But it's just not going to happen. I mean, you can sort of figure out samsara to some degree, which is what science is really good at, or at least it's better than anything else we know of at present. Empirical science, scientific method. But the ultimate is beyond that. Science can't touch that either. So, I mean, maybe you could just try and get into like Kant, Immanuel Kant, where, I mean, that's what he did best, was explaining how people can't really know the thing in itself. All they can know is the thing as it seems. But Kant was not a mystic. And so, I mean, there is one thing in itself that we have direct access to. There is one ultimate reality that we really can know directly, and that is the thing in itself of our own consciousness. And that is not perception and symbols. That's just consciousness as consciousness. Because once you get into thoughts and perceptions and so forth, then you're dealing with the thing as it seems. So I'm just going to move on to Zenithoid's next very long question, which is, would it be fair to say that the Buddha is the incarnation of the Absolute in the same way that Jesus and Krishna claim to be? And I could just stop here, but he keeps going. I believe that neither Jesus nor Krishna can truly be the Absolute if they have contingent aspects. I don't know how Hindus deal with this issue, but Christians have a few ideas to deal with this problem. 1, Christ is just a prophet, not God and not absolute. That's the Arian heresy. 2, Christ only has a divine nature. This would make him not man and therefore not a sinless man who could redeem mankind through his conquer of death. That was like some Gnostic sects, I think. 3, Christ, or also, what was it, the Quietists or something like that. 3, Christ has a human nature and a divine nature. This means that he has two wills. Oriental Orthodox Christians claim this understanding would mean that there are two sons instead of one, as there can only be one will within a mind, and therefore false. Yeah, I think that was like the heresy of Saint Cyril of Alexandria or something. The polyphysite, no, duophysite, monophysite, I don't know. 4, Christ has one nature which is both human and divine. This is what Oriental Orthodox believe. The polemic made by other Christians is that this means Christ is neither created nor uncreated, which fails on an excluded middle and makes him not God because God is only uncreated. I think that the Buddha has the same symbolic archetypal significance within the collective unconscious as Jesus and Krishna, that being the perfect human who is one with the Absolute, but I don't think this works going with strict Aristotelian logic. Because the absolute is totally not understandable through words, if we were going to try to intellectualize what the Buddha became upon achieving enlightenment, we would have to divide him into a conditioned and unconditioned nature, apply to him something which lies outside the five aggregates, etc. I don't think we can describe him properly, just as we can't describe Nibbana. Okay, so the actual question is way up at the top here. Would it be fair to say that the Buddha is the incarnation of the absolute in the same way that Jesus and Krishna claim to be? He wouldn't really be an incarnation of the absolute. I mean, he wasn't enlightened when he was born. He didn't get enlightened until, he was, 29 years old? Or was it, that was when he renounced the world? Yeah, I think that's when he renounced the world. So, he didn't become enlightened until he was sitting under the Bodhi tree and became enlightened. Before that, he apparently wasn't the incarnation of the absolute. And incarnation would seem to assume that you were born that way. Incarnation. So the way it works is that you got, let's say, just a totally foolish person, like maybe a vampire or something, some soulless being who is just totally foolish, and has no wisdom other than maybe a certain worldly cunning. They would be spiritually opaque, like Satan or something. Then the ordinary person, any being that has what Mahayana Buddhists call the Buddha nature, would be sort of translucent, like a bathroom window, or the shower curtain, or the door to the shower. Light goes through it, but not perfectly. And then an enlightened being would be like spiritually transparent. It's just, there'd be no distortion. So somebody like Neem Karoli Baba up there on the altar, right there. I mean, he was considered to be just a Sat Guru. He was just God personified, God in human form. And I mean, it's just kind of the way it is. He was just sort of spiritually transparent, or at least his devotees considered him to just, God just shone through him because he had sort of this, like, attenuated his ego or attenuated his delusion sufficiently that, I mean, the spirit, light of spirit, which is always there, just shone through him unimpeded. And the Buddha would be like that, I suppose. It's not like you're attaining anything, though, really. It's like, let's see. There's a piece of paper, right? Well, no, forget the piece of paper. Let's just go with the uncarved block of marble that I'm always harping away at. And you've got all these statues in that block of marble. So if you're at the level of unenlightenment, you're dealing with the statues. You just see them as these entities. They're these images, But when you become fully enlightened, you realize it's all just this block of marble. That the statues contained inside that block of marble are virtual. They're really in there in a sense, but it's virtual. It takes imagination, a certain amount of illusion to create these statues. But once you become enlightened, I mean, like one of these statues, once one of these statues somehow becomes enlightened, you've got enlightened statues in there. Every possible statue is in there, including statues of enlightened beings. Then they realize that it's just stone. And so they no longer have this false identity as this individual being. It's just, they just merge with the stone. And so it's like when you're calling that stone God, or the essence of God, the Dharmakaya, the Tao, Brahman, whatever you want to call the absolute, I mean, we're already that. We're already 100% that. It's just that an enlightened being, they don't have any illusions fucking up that. It's no longer distorted. So the Buddha would be like that. Any enlightened being would be like that. Maybe Jesus, although his behavior in the New Testament would not be enlightened behavior from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, but take that for what it's worth. So yeah, Krishna also, he was an avatar of Vishnu. To the Vaishnavite Hindus, he was, that's the highest God. He was just God, the absolute personified. It wasn't that you had this God right here and outside of him was not God. It's just everything is God. It's all God. And then you just have this one being here that knows that. And that he's no longer identifying with anything other than that. Maybe at this kind of the surface level, it may appear that he still has an ego and a personality and so on and so forth. But deep down, it's like the absolute is just, he's aware of the absolute. And just, or if in Christian terms, he is just aware that the Spirit of God is completely just suffusing his entire body. And everything else too. Everything outside of his body is equally 100% suffused by the Spirit of God, or whatever you want to call it. Which in Buddhism isn't even reified, and so it's off the scale, and you can't say whether it exists or doesn't exist. Partly because it's formless. So, would it be fair to say that the Buddha is the incarnation of the Absolute in the same way that Jesus and Krishna claim to be? Not in the same way as Jesus, because I don't think that Jesus, he was considered to be the only begotten Son of God. So he was just qualitatively different from everybody else. Whereas the Buddha was just a human being. He was a human being who had, he had eradicated attraction, aversion, and semi-conscious stupidity from his mind. And so, in a way, he just kind of merged with this enigmatic, paradoxical absolute, which can't be said to exist or not exist. And maybe Krishna would be somewhat intermediate, because Krishna would still be sort of qualitatively different from an ordinary human being, because we're not all avatars of Vishnu. But really, at the moment of enlightenment, nothing is gained. You're just realizing what has always been there from the beginning. So an enlightened being is different from any other being, simply in that he's like spiritually transparent. He doesn't have any self-illusions getting in the way of the absolute and realizing the absolute is there and everywhere else. So I don't know if that explained anything, but I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Yuga'u. And Yuga'u says, now that a big T is back in the house, yo, from Buddhist standpoint, tell us, will he or will he not bring anything good to this world of ours? Well, I think one of the main goods that Donald Trump will bring to the world is that he is going to be a thorn in the side of creeping degeneracy. That the left has, like, degeneracy is practically their battle cry. It's like they're promoting that. And it's just amazing. Like, you watch all the meltdown videos on YouTube or Twitter or whatever. This leftist after leftist after leftist, most of them female, they're just like freaking out. They're just convinced that the world is coming to an end. And it's, in a way, they're just symbolic of the decline and fall of Western civilization, just decadence. Decadence used to be a big deal. Like, historians would talk about a society in decay. The decadence of this society was causing, this societal decadence resulted in the fall of the civilization and so forth. They don't talk about it anymore because we're smack dab in the middle of it. And so Donald Trump sort of, he's not like some reactionary fighting to return to the old ways so much as he's just calling out the really obvious degeneracy of, just like bringing sexual deviance right into the mainstream. To tolerate sexual deviance, that's fine. It's like most sexual deviance, or at least a lot of deviations from the biological norm, they're not exactly harmful. So long as you're not being a predator on children or something, then, that's fine. Maybe. So long as it's, in private somewhere between consenting adults. But, to just drag them into the mainstream. So you've got like government embassies flying the rainbow flag, that kind of thing. And it's just, you got trannies in the military. In fact, in high command, it's like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He at the time that he wrote this, which is like the late 1700s, it was just considered to be a truism among historians at the time that a telltale sign of a civilization in severe decline is the rise of eunuchs into social prominence. And that's what's happening now in the West, except we don't call them eunuchs, we call them trans. And Donald Trump is going to be definitely throwing a monkey wrench into that, which is a good thing. I mean, he's not going to have us all, like everyone has to have a Bible that they carry with them at all times, any such thing. He's relatively moderate in that regard, but even being a moderate is a hell of a lot better than just parading degeneracy and celebrating it. I mean, the left, they have removed any kind of sensual excess from the entire field of ethics. Like sensual excess, drug abuse, gluttony, sexual overindulgence, that kind of stuff. It's no longer an ethical issue anymore. To a lot of people, like in the new left especially. And so there is kind of a pushback against that because it just goes against just common sense to the average person. That's one reason why Kamala Harris lost. She's got like moral degenerates twerking at her rallies on stage. That kind of stuff. Just celebrating it. So yeah, that would be one good thing, is that Donald Trump is sort of facilitating a return to more normal values with less celebration of degeneracy, less celebration of decline and fall. Also, I mean, there's going to be more honesty in government with him, which, I mean, some people may just laugh at the very idea because they have been indoctrinated to believe that he is just the worst liar that ever existed. When, I mean, if you look at the debates and you count the lies on both sides, Donald Trump probably tells fewer lies than his opponents. And his lies are mainly just sort of exaggerating, like a car salesman might exaggerate how good the car is. So let's see, from a Buddhist standpoint, tell us, will he or will he not bring anything good to this world of ours? Yeah, I think he's returning some common sense, which is, like a secular, worldly kind of common sense. But even that's better than just flat out lunacy and just lying. I mean, the mainstream media, they're just professional liars at this point. Faith in America in the mainstream media is down below 20%, I think. And most of the people that believe it are on the left. It's down to like 8% for like right-wingers or conservatives or traditionalists, people who vote Republican. So let's see here. Yeah, I do think that he will bring something good to this world of ours. Of course, there's going to be just people raging in hysteria for the next 4 years, but maybe if some of them at least have enough self-awareness to realize that, I mean, when they're in the minority, Trump won the popular vote. He won more than half the country, in just vote-wise, that they're in the minority. And they can't really be lied to anymore to believe that they're the majority, they're on the right side of history, and Trumpism is just some sort of weird cult. I mean, they might still believe that, but now they have to accept that cult is taking over the country. And I think that's a good thing because, I mean, the cult is really what's being brainwashed into these people, like at universities and even like kindergartens now. They're just raised into it. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Yugu's next question, which is also from Karmic View. Are you happy that you were born in USA? Is there any other country you wished you could have been born to? Well, like ancient India in the Buddhist time, like northern India, the Ganges Valley. I mean, being born into certain cultures of the past, which maybe I was born into those cultures in the past. But nowadays, I was born in 1963, and the USA was obviously the place where I should have been born. Your karma lands you where you ought to be. So I'm satisfied with that. And like I said earlier, like unquestioning obedience is just not one of my personality traits. And so USA, I mean, America was born of disobedience. We were born of civil disobedience and rebellion. Our national anthem is actually a war song about it's War of 1812, but still, maybe the British still hadn't fully accepted our independence at that time. So yeah, I'm happy that I was born in the USA, and I am happy that the neo-Marxists lost the election, and they lost big. I don't think they fully realized just how badly they were beaten. Because now we've got the president, we've got the Senate, very probably the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, most of the governors, most of the people. And Trump, I think he's learned his lessons from the first time. He was actually trying to put out an olive branch to like the neocon globalist, the globalist Republican elite, like inviting them to participate, and they were just stabbing him in the back every chance they got. And I think he's learned from that. And most of them have been purged now. The Republican voters have just purged them like they were all Liz Cheney. So I think he may go scorched earth, and I think that would be extremely entertaining. So yeah, I'm glad I'm an American. I mean, I can't think of any other country in the world today that I would prefer being born into. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, and this one is from Jazz. And Jazz lives in Thailand. And so he has asked me these questions through a friend, through email. So I hope he sees the video, because it's in the video that I'm answering his questions. So Jazz says, is it good to set aspirations for the future, quitting sugar addiction, hoping to encounter wise and noble teachers, aspiring to live as a single person for the rest of my life? So is it good to set aspirations for the future? Well, in the texts, in the early Buddhist text, it says a wise man would have no aspirations. You're not hoping for some future state. You're just right here in the present, being as mindful and detached and equanimous as you can manage, without worrying about the future, not worrying about the past, not worrying about stuff that doesn't exist. But, I mean, you can make plans. I mean, so long as we're living in this world, we can make plans. I mean, quitting sugar addiction is not so much an aspiration as, it's just like a task, it's like something to do, which we all have to do that. We all have to acknowledge that there are things that need to get done. And if you really think that quitting sugar addiction is something that needs to be done, you should just set about to do it. I mean, there's no need to really aspire to it all that much. It's just something to do, so you do it. Hoping to encounter wise and noble teachers. I mean, hope is, that's also something that's really not encouraged in early Buddhism. Because again, you're just like thinking about some future state that isn't right here, right now. It's sort of like you're wandering off into unreality. But I mean, you can live your life in such a way as to maximize the odds of encountering wise and noble teachers. Do your best, that sort of thing. I mean, it's more like task-oriented behavior rather than, like aspiration. Like you got something to do, you got to change the tire on your car. I mean, you don't have to aspire to changing the tire on your car. You just acknowledge the tire has to be changed, and so you set about changing it. So, yeah, I mean, it's more of a pragmatic thing. Aspiration seems kind of idealistic. Whereas, I mean, if you just set about to do something, but you really have to be careful of goal-oriented dharma. Because, usually the future is not the way we expect it to be. We can plan out the future, but it's never going to be exactly the way we want it. And so it's best not to have much attachment to any future state. Just live your life in a way that is as good as you can manage. And I mean, you can acknowledge that there's things that you should do. And so you should set about trying to do those things. But maybe describing it as an aspiration isn't nearly as good as just describing it as like even calling it a goal is maybe pushing it a little bit. It's just something to be done. It's like a duty. Maybe that's the way to do it. It's your sacred duty to maximize your chances of encountering wise and noble teachers, for example. And I'm not exactly sure that I answered that one. So let's just move on to Jazz's second question and see if I can be more certain of answering that one. It is as follows. Is it okay to focus on one of the Brahmaviharas individually, or is it better to practice them in conjunction with one another? Why is it better to practice all four as opposed to just upekkha or equanimity? Well, different people have different characters, and certain Brahmaviharas, which the four Brahmaviharas are metta, or like loving kindness. The usual translation is loving kindness, like, benevolence. 2 is compassion, karuna, or compassion. And then you got mudita, or sympathetic joy, which is taking joy in other people's joy. And then 4th is upekkha, or equanimity. And different characters are going to do better at different Brahmaviharas. Some people will just be really good at cultivating compassion, for example, maybe not so good at equanimity. Some people will be really good at metta, which is the main one that gets taught the most, gets practiced the most, and maybe they're not so good at mudita or something. And as a general rule, you're more likely to master one thing than you are to master 4. So, generally, unless you're just really drawn to doing all 4 and you can do all 4 well, then probably you'd be better off just emphasizing one of them. And then you could maybe do the other 3 a little bit, but just to put most of your emphasis on one of them. And that would be the one that you're the best at, or maybe it's the one that you feel deep down is the one you need to cultivate the most, maybe because you just are lacking in that or something. So that's the one you really need to work on. It'd be one or the other, either the one you're the best at or the one that you just feel that you need to work on the most because maybe you're just not good enough at that one. But trying to do all 4 at the same time, it decreases your odds, down to 25% that you're going to really be good at what you're doing than if you just emphasize one of them. But it may be some people just can do all 4. Maybe they've got paramis, they got momentum going from past lives, cultivating all 4 or something, and they can do it really well. So, yeah, I think the standard way of doing it is to emphasize one of them. But one size does not fit all for everybody. And so I'm just going to move on to the next one from Jazz, which is tips and advice on how to sleep in a sitting posture. Yeah, that's the sitting Dhutanga. It's one of the 13 optional ascetic practices for monks. And I think it's chapter 2 of the Visuddhimagga. So, you could read chapter 2 of the Visuddhimagga if you've got it, which is just an overview of the 13 Dhutangas. Each Dhutanga has three levels: easy, medium, and hard. So the sitting practice, where you never lie down, you sleep in a sitting position, also has easy, medium, and hard. Easy is you're allowed to sit in like a chair that might lean back a little bit. And the way I always figured it is if it's less than 45 degrees, it's on the side of perpendicular from 45, then you're still sitting up. But if it's less than 45, then you're just lying down. So you could get a kind of reclining chair that, and not recline it all the way back, but have it, like closer to perpendicular than 45 degrees. That would be the easy way of doing the sitting practice. The second level, the medium level, which is what I did as a monk for a couple of years, is you're allowed to lean back against something. So I just had a board, like a flat, like a 1x8 or something. I had it leaning against the wall, and then I would lean against that. I'd have to have a pillow because I've got sort of a sway back. My back is kind of S-shaped, and I'd have to lean my head way back, and it was harder to breathe if I didn't use a pillow. So I still had to use a pillow, and it's hard to get used to because, like, when I was first trying to do this, I'd wake up at 3 a.m, just flopped over on my side. One time I remember I was sitting in the full lotus position in the meditation hall, and I just like fell over still in the full lotus, just sleeping. Also, there's another way of doing the medium level. If you're not going to lean back, you can take like a rope or a belt or something. You can raise your knees up, and then you have the rope like around your back and around your knees, kind of holding you up that way. But I don't think that would work very well unless you were sitting on something very soft, because I think your ass bone would be grinding into the floor, and it'd get relatively painful after a while. So let's just skip the rope or the belt or whatever, and just say that you're sitting on the floor but leaning back against something. And then the hard level is you're not leaning back against anything. You're not sitting in a chair. For the most part, you're just sitting as though in meditation and sleeping that way. And I've been told that the late Webu Sayadaw of Burma actually slept just sitting upright in meditative posture. I did know one American monk who was trying to do all of the Dhutangas at the highest level. And he kind of cheated a little bit because he took his alms bowl, put it in front of him, and then leaned forward. He rested his forehead onto his alms bowl and slept that way. And he wasn't getting enough sleep, and it really took a toll on him, and he had to drop out of the monkhood because he had a kind of breakdown, mainly from lack of sleep. And then as soon as he recovered, he came back to Burma and reordained and was a monk for many more years. So, yeah, those are the 3 ways you can do it according to the Visuddhimagga. And it does take some getting used to. Like, especially if you're doing it at the medium or the hard level, it may take months before you can really go to sleep and then wake up the next morning still sitting and not just flopped over on your side on the floor. But I mean, there's a good chance you're going to wind up getting like bed sores on your behind and everything. If you're meditating, sitting in meditation all day and sitting in sleep all night, where you're just sitting most of the day and night, then I mean, that can result in like bed sores and that kind of thing. I speak from experience on that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Krypton Air. Yeah, 2 hours and 12 minutes. That's not too bad, I guess. Krypton Air says, what are you using to measure the amount of progress you make? Is it based on general equanimity in everyday life, the amount of reduction in emotional intensity with regards to emotional reactions to events and circumstances, base resting mental state? Have you considered the possibility of deep sankharas arising and clouding your current mind state like dust in the air as a result of sweeping the floor? Well, that's kind of 2 questions, I guess. But I think the main one is, what are you using to measure the amount of progress you make? Well, I never really measured the amount of progress I made other than in meditation. I mean, your progress in meditation is pretty easy to gauge. It's just, how well do you keep your mind on the primary object of meditation? How much are you thinking? How little are you thinking? How well can you just sit there without your mind wandering? How long can you keep your mind focused on the meditative object? Or if you even go beyond having meditative objects, how long can you just sit there just empty? So that's a fairly good way of measuring your progress in meditation. With regard to everyday life, it's not nearly so easy. I mean, you're probably better off not measuring it. I mean, like the word mana in Pali usually is translated as conceit, sometimes as pride, and it's something you're not supposed to have. It's like unwholesome karma. But literally, mana means measuring. It's like measuring yourself up. And like to compare yourself to somebody else is a kind of mana. Even if you consider yourself inferior to somebody else, that's still mana. It's still, you're like measuring yourself. So you're probably better off not measuring or trying to measure the amount of progress you're making in Dhamma. You should just keep practicing, because sometimes, like Krypton Air here is implying towards the end, sometimes it's not clear. Like one story that I've given before is there's this guy who has a big rock in his backyard, and he doesn't like that rock. It's hard to get the lawnmower around it. He's got to get the weed eater out and like trim around this rock because he can't get the lawnmower up against it. So he doesn't like this rock. He's going to move this rock out of his backyard, going to move it over to the side or something. And so he goes out there and starts tugging and pushing and pulling on this rock, and he can't budge it, but he's stubborn. So he just, every day he's out there just pushing and pulling and shoving on this rock. And little does he know that rock, that boulder that he's trying to move out of his backyard, actually goes down like 12 feet. It's just a huge thing that weighs many tons. There's no way he could possibly move it. But eventually he can't move it. He doesn't know that it's this huge, like this huge boulder. And he just gives up in despair and thinks that he's made no progress, when actually all that pushing and pulling on this rock has resulted in him being just like muscular and athletic. He's in really good shape because of all this strenuously pushing and pulling on this rock, trying to move it. And even though he couldn't move it at all, and it seems like he totally failed, nevertheless, without him really noticing it, he's buff now. He's a Chad. And meditation can be that way. It's like, it seems like you're not making any progress, but any effort you make is going to yield results, even if you don't notice the results. Any effort you make is going to bear fruit. So maybe one of the best ways of measuring the amount of progress you make is by just keeping in mind how much effort you have made. But really trying to figure it out is not so easy. You may think that you're just chilled. You think that you got light shining out of you. You think you've made some attainment or something, and it may not be that way at all. Ram Dass gave this story once, probably more than once, about this hermit who lives out in the forest. And he's meditating every day, and he's doing all this practice until it's like there's light shining out of him, and he thinks he's really attained something, and he thinks he's ready to go back into society. So he walks into town, and he's on the sidewalk, and somebody just jostles up against him, and he gets pissed off. It just annoys him. It's like he thinks that he's enlightened or something, but then something comes up, and these old habits just arise. They were latent tendencies, anusyas, they're called in Pali, that, you can't really know. Maybe you can judge the progress you make by how you deal with situations when the shit is hitting the fan. That might be some kind of way of gauging whether you're making progress or not. That a certain situation that might have had you blowing your stack years ago, now it's like you can deal with it calmly, that kind of thing. That would be some evidence. But it may be just because you're older. You're just getting too old for that shit. So yeah, you're probably better off not trying to measure the amount of progress you make. You're better off with just conscientiously striving to be better. Just conscientiously, doing your spiritual practice, and not even caring about the results. It's your duty to do this spiritual practice regardless of the results. Because, keeping a scorecard and writing down numbers on a piece of paper and all that, it really is not particularly helpful. Unless it's just something in particular you're trying to keep track of. Like, for example, a few times as a monk, I would keep track of how much I was sleeping as a way of reducing the amount of sleep that I was indulging in. But even that wasn't really trying to measure my progress. It was just keeping track of how much I was sleeping. So I hope I answered that one, because I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Kazar. And at the time that I first saw this, I didn't understand the question, but now I think I do. Kazar says, "Did you release the monkeys?" And I think I heard that somewhere in South Carolina, the state of South Carolina, like 43 monkeys escaped from a laboratory, which probably means that some animal rights activist infiltrated that laboratory and let them loose. And it wasn't me. I was not the animal rights activist who released those monkeys. And I do not have an emergency backup beverage, so I'm just going to have to survive the rest of this video with no freaking beverage. So, I mean, I can sympathize with animal rights activists who liberate monkeys. Like I mentioned, maybe in the previous Q&A, I was reading a book I read more than one book on how the brain works. And it's just grisly, horrifying kind of experiments they do on these monkeys. Just really awful experiments, cutting off the top of their skull and planting electrodes in their brain and strapping them into this frame thing and making them, with one hand that can still move, they're like pulling a lever to try and solve problems or something, and they're seeing what part of the brain is firing when they're doing this and all that. It's like, and then of course when the experiment's done, they don't just like replace the top of their skull and give them a banana and send them on their way. It's like they're just destroyed. They remove the brain and like do a analysis on any changes that happen in the brain or that sort of thing. So no, I did not release the monkeys. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. That was an easy question to answer. I could have just said nope and moved on, but I've got to have long digressions in my answers or it just doesn't work somehow. So the next question is from Rui. And Rui says, I've been watching a multitude of iterations of the woke meltdown online in the wake of Donald J. Trump's landslide victory and cannot help but think of Frank Herbert's Fear is the Mind Killer in the novel Dune. Indeed, these psychotic, hysterical meltdowns seem to be utterly fear-based, and while these snippets of online mental collapse are sad to watch, they also offer an opportunity for contemplation. On this occasion, would you like to speak a bit on Buddha Dhamma as a path to fear-proof the mind? Well, I don't think I've been watching a lot of the meltdown videos too. And for me, sometimes it's an interesting anthropological study. I don't think it's all based on fear. To some degree, it's like infantile tantrums because they didn't get their way. That, it's partly fear, I guess, but to some degree, it's just this meltdown of them insisting on Kamala winning, just absolutely vehemently insisting that she has to win, and then they don't get that. And then it just like something snaps. It's like an infantile kind of a thing where they're throwing a tantrum because they want ice cream or some such. But then again, there is some fears. They have been indoctrinated to believe Donald Trump is the second coming of Adolf Hitler, that he is a fascist, that he is going to destroy American democracy, even though the left was doing more of democracy destroying than Donald Trump ever did. That he's going to destroy the Constitution. He's going to abolish the Constitution, even though the left is really doing more against the Constitution than Donald Trump ever did, et cetera, et cetera. So with that as kind of a preamble, Rui here is asking, let's see, on this occasion, would you like to speak a bit on Buddha Dhamma as a path to fear-proof the mind? Well, yeah, there's different ways that Dhamma will help to make you fear resistant. Like I've said before, the samurai warriors of medieval Japan used to spend time at Zen monasteries to help them overcome their fear of death. And certainly Dhamma can help you to overcome your fear of death. I think just about anybody, even someone who has lived in a monastery for years, if somebody put a knife to their throat, they'd start sweating and their heartbeat would increase. They'd start breathing a little faster. I mean, that's just natural. But, I mean, fear of death especially, I mean, if you're just going to get reborn anyway, it's not that big of a deal. Like some spiritual teachers say, I mean, after you've died, you're going to realize it's like, wow, I've done this lots of times before. It's not that big of a deal. But with regard to fear in general, of course, the panacea, the surefire cure for that, even though it takes some time to do it, is mindfulness. It's like fear arises. If you're mindful, it's like fear is arising. It's not, I'm afraid, like an unmindful person, they're afraid. It's like, I'm afraid, I'm scared shitless. But if you're mindful, fear starts to arise, and it's fear is arising. It's not you. If you are anything at all, you're the observer and not the object being observed. So when the fear just becomes the object being observed, you have this philosophical detachment, this separation from it, and it's not you. It's just this phenomenon that's arising. The thing is that if you wait until you're afraid before you try to practice this, it's not going to work. It's like you're already all doped up on adrenaline and you're all agitated and everything, and it's already derailed. So, you have to practice it when you don't really need it yet. You can argue you need it all the time, but you practice it when you're calm so that it becomes second nature. And then when something, whatever it is, arises, then it's just second nature that you observe the phenomenon, you're detached from it, and it's not you. And then when it's not you and you're detached from it, you don't reinforce it, you don't feed it, and it gradually dwindles away. And the habit eventually dies out or just becomes a pale shadow of what it used to be. And also, just living an ascetic existence like monks lived. I remember one time I was at my father's house, and they had like rats in the attic or something, and my stepmother poisoned these rats. She knew better than to ask me to do it because I was a Buddhist monk at the time. So anyways, I'm sitting there in a chair next to my father, and we're talking, and I look down, and there's a rat like looking up at me on the floor. It had reached the stage of, what is it, cyanide poisoning or whatever. Is it cyanide? Whatever the usual rat poison is. It was just kind of sitting there in broad daylight. And it's like, I was so used to living in Burma. It's just, oh, there's a rat under the table, Dad. It was like no big deal. Some people would be very startled. They look down and see a rat looking up at them. But I've had rats crawling on me at night when I'm trying to sleep. Scorpions on me at night when I'm trying to sleep. I got stung by a scorpion once. I was sleeping on my bed in my cave. I feel something crawling on me. I figure it's just like a cockroach or something. I try to brush it off, and it turned out to be a scorpion, and it stung me. But if you're detached from your own existence, you don't have a lot of attachment to things, then it's going to make you less afraid. And also, just living a relatively tough ascetic kind of existence, it just kind of brings out the stoic in people, and you just gradually become less fearful. Or at least that was the way it worked for me. Let's see. So where's the question again here? Would you like to speak a bit on Buddha Dhamma as a path to fear-proof the mind? Yeah, ultimately, it's mindfulness that fear-proofs the mind. Because then even if fear starts to arise, you detach from it, and it's not you. It's just a mental phenomenon that is arising, which you are observing like an anthropologist observing some artifact of humanity. But of course, like I was also saying, there are other ways that Buddha Dhamma also can make a person less fearful. But I'm just going to move on to the next question now. This is from Wilson. And Wilson says, is there a Dalai Lama or Pope of Theravada? If so, who is he? And no, there is not. Each country has each Theravada Buddhist country will have a leader of the Sangha. I suppose in Thailand, it's the Sangha Raja, the king of the Sangha, who is the number one monk in Thailand, but he has zero authority in Burma or Sri Lanka. In Burma, it's the Sangha Mahanayaka Sayadaw, who is considered to be the top-ranking ecclesiastical figure in the Burmese Sangha. I'm not sure what it would be in Sri Lanka. I assume they have that, or it may be that each individual sect of Theravada, each monastic tradition in Theravada has its own leader. So it may be the closest you've got to a pope of Theravada would just be whoever has been monk the longest. He would be the senior monk, and he may not have much authority, but at least he gets to sit in the front and he gets to walk in the front of the line, that kind of thing. All the other monks have to bow to him, because who you bow to is just purely a matter of seniority. Whoever's the senior monk gets bowed to. The junior monk bows to the senior monk. So, I mean, there would have to be a monk who had been in the Sangha the longest. And I mean, there's a few monks. I met one monk. He was Shui Hinta Siero. He must be long gone by now. He was 102 years old when I met him. And in all likelihood, he was ordained as a monk when he was 20. So he'd been a monk for like 82 years. He was a novice before that, I assume. So he wasn't the highest ranking monk. Ecclesiastically, he wasn't the Sangha Mahanayaka Seattle, though. So yeah, the easy answer to Wilson's question is no. There is not just a supreme leader of Theravada Buddhism. It's just each country has like the highest ranking ecclesiastical, equivalent to like an archbishop or something. So I'm just going to move on to Wilson's next question, which is there any specific advice about dealing with strong feelings of regret or the desire to go back in time and fix something? This seems to me to be much harder to let go of than other hindrances. And again, it's the same thing as with fear. It's mindfulness is how you deal with it. You get into the habit of being mindful of thoughts and feelings that arise. And then when this particular kind of feeling arises, I mean, it's just second nature. You just observe it and let it go. It may not go away immediately, so you might have to observe it and let it go several times, or just keep doing that. Just keep observing it as just this object that isn't you. But once you really take it to heart that regret is just always bad karma, then it makes you almost immune to it. You might have a little twinge of it every now and then, but still, I mean, once it's sort of like the previous question about trying to figure out reality. How can I stop like trying to figure out reality? It's like once you fully realize that it's impossible, or in this case, once you take it to heart that regret is always, every single time, just bad karma. It just makes things worse. That once you really take that to heart, I mean, it's like you don't go there anymore. It's just, why do it? It just automatically just drops away as a general rule. So, I mean, through mindfulness and then just really trying to really understand that regret, the stewing over the past, doesn't help anything. It just makes things worse. You're just making the situation worse. So I'm just going to move on to Wilson's third question, which is, are one's intentions at the mercy of conditioned events? One's intentions are the ultimate arbiter of karma, like you said earlier about saving the frog from the snake. However, it seems like they might be able to change involuntarily. Hypothetical scenario. You see a suffering homeless man on the street and you take out your wallet to give him some money so that he can afford food or medical care. As you reach for the dollar, suddenly out of the corner of your eye you see a famous YouTube star who searches for people doing good deeds and gives them $10,000 if he catches them in the act. He sees you and turns his camera to face you. The dollar is in your hand. What do? It seems like now, having known that you absolutely will get a reward for this act, the motivation for doing this to get $10,000 could spring up in your mind and dominate your motivation for helping the homeless out of compassion. Your intentions are now dirtied by events outside of your control. On the other hand, not giving the money because you want to avoid the situation also sounds bad. What would a good Buddhist do in this scenario? Well, $1 is kind of cheap, don't you think? I mean, probably you should give him more than just $1, especially if he needs medical care. I mean, $1 is not going to get you very far. But setting that aside, I mean, still, let's see, intentions are, let's see, where does he say it here? No, yeah, your intentions do not change involuntarily. I mean, you may not have complete conscious control over your intentions because your intentions are not entirely subject to your ego, to your thinking mind. So that's the thing. It's hard for a lot of people to understand. They just naturally identify with their ego. They think their ego is me. And so their mind is doing something beyond the control of their conscious ego. And they just think that it's like involuntary or something. But really, it's like this subconscious intention that's just not under the control of their ego. So I say so a lot, don't I? It just seems to be appropriate to say. With regard to this whole YouTube thing, I mean, you should just stick with the original intention. I mean, you're going to be aware of this guy watching you. I mean, I'd be embarrassed of getting caught just giving $1. I mean, I might reach in and pull out a few more ones at least. But even, I mean, ultimately, it's your karma to have this YouTube guy there, and your karma, the fruition of your karma is intention. You're not so much intention as volition or will. So, I mean, it's all generated by your mind. But where is the question here? Let's see. What would a good Buddhist do in this scenario? I mean, you just give him the money. I mean, just try to ignore the YouTube guy. And then if the YouTube guy gives you $10,000, you could give even more to the beggar. I guess. Kind of an unusual sort of circumstance. That's never happened to me before, actually. But I mean, if your intention is to give money to this beggar, then you just give the money to the beggar, and anybody watching you should be irrelevant. Doesn't always work that way, but I mean, that would be how a good Buddhist would do it, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. Just scrolling down a little bit. I think we're getting kind of close to the bottom of the scroll. Thermal Squid says, why are normies condemnable or blamable at a spiritual level? I hear that term used often here as a point about the dullness of their mediocrity, but I find that it's typically normality and formality in general, which is assumably comfortable or safe. You do not need to worry about the average person holding some extreme or delusional view, being neurodivergent or mentally unstable, or otherwise as unpredictable or unadjusted. I feel as if those that consider themselves to be above the rest or employ this term are often just unfortunate and no more intelligent or wise than anyone else. So I guess the main question here is, why are normies, in air quotes, condemnable or blamable at a spiritual level? Well, I mean, they're not condemnable or blamable, really. But, I mean, he says a little farther down here, you do not need to worry about the average person holding some extreme or delusional view. Everybody holds a delusional view. It's just that the normies, so-called, share this more or less the same delusion. But they're still very delusional. And sometimes I'll use the word normie as just a loose translation of the Pali word putujana, which means common person. Normie is a normal person. And from the Buddhist point of view, the normal person, the putujana, is insane. Putujano umadako. The common person is out of his mind. So at a spiritual level, yeah, all normies are delusional. It may be that they share the same kind of delusion, which makes it a kind of conventional truth. It's uniform enough that they can function and interact, but still they're living in a delusional world. And all of us are that are not fully enlightened. So it's not like I'm trying to pick on anybody. And the Pali texts just hammer away at this. So let's see here. It says, you do not need to worry about the average person holding some extreme or delusional view. Well, not so much extreme, but definitely delusional. Being neurodivergent or mentally unstable, well, like Freud says, everyone is neurotic at the very least. Yeah, I mean, the normal person can be mentally unstable. Let's see, or otherwise unpredictable or unadjusted. I mean, so what if they're predictable? I mean, that's really not like the spiritual criterion for judging like who you want to associate with is how well they're predictable, how predictable they are, or how adjusted they are to an insane society. Like Eric Fromm, he was part of the Frankfurt School for a while. He was a unabashed socialist. My father was also a socialist. I mean, he was sort of a strong union man, and he was a naive socialist back in the old days when socialists could still be tough. You know, he was sort of a Jack London type socialist. But anyways, getting back to Eric Fromm, I mean, he says that in an insane society, it's the people who are adjusted to that society who are the insane ones. That in an insane society, the people who are the most sane are going to appear maladjusted. So, yeah, I mean, if you're just going like grading on the curve, going with statistical averages and so forth, then yeah, then I guess the average person is like right there in the center of what is like normal. That's why they're called normies, I guess. And I mean, they would be considered healthy, I suppose, relatively anyway. But from the point of view of Buddhism or like Eastern spirituality in general, I mean, the average person is insane because this is not reality. So I think I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's second question because these are all kind of related to each other. And he says, this ties into a conversation I had with Lieberlam, formerly known as Lieberlam. Now he's Stellar Supreme. This ties into a conversation I had with Lieberlam recently as well. Why is conformity considered to be an effeminate behavior? I see that dissident and revolutionary personalities tend to be degenerate, prone to violence, drug use, immoral, and nihilistic. In general, a bohemian or some kind of atypical consciousness seems naturally averse to wisdom or something like Dhamma. Conformity, then, is only undesirable in modernity with its unique conditions. A person that is disposed to being different just because, or sticking it to the man, is immature and usually unskillful. Typically, this crowd takes pride in having mental illness or cementing their individuality in some pathological criteria. I don't see how edginess or individualistic loudmouth characteristics are conducive to the cultivation of virtue, just as an example. So I guess the only question mark to this is at the top here. Why is conformity considered to be an effeminate behavior? And I mean, it is true that women are more conformist than men are. And that's just, it's part of our psychological sexual dimorphism. My father, who was somewhat of an authority on women, had this saying that he said several times, I recall when I was a kid. He said that if it ever became the fashion for women to have their heads shaved and their scalp painted with red and green checks, they'd all be rushing to the beauty parlors to have it done. Women, more than men, are slaves to fashion. They have to conform to a greater degree than men do. So that would be why conformity is considered to be an effeminate behavior, because it is more feminine than masculine. So let's see. That would be the simple answer. The clothing industries tried in vain for decades to try to get men as enslaved to fashion trends as women, and they failed. Men were much more likely to just wear the same jacket, the same pants for 15 years straight until they just wore out. Whereas women, they might have to get a whole different set of clothes every 6 months, some of the really fashion conscious ones. You know, now in autumn, it's like subdued grays and browns. It's like, well, we're going to have to get a new wardrobe. So that is why conformity is considered to be an effeminate behavior. It's just an anthropological thing that women, throughout most of the history of the human race, they were much more prone than men are of just being like captured as booty by an enemy tribe. The men all get slaughtered, The women get enslaved. They get brought over and kept as concubines, just like prizes of war, booty, so to speak. And so women are much more likely to all of a sudden find themselves, throughout most of the history of the human race, much more likely to all of a sudden land in a totally different environment, a different society, worshiping different gods with different taboos, different kind of clothing styles and everything. And so women are much more flexible and much more likely to conform to the society in general, which is one reason why it's mostly these young women who are shrieking and screaming and crying hysterically on these meltdown videos because Trump won. They conform to an insane society that is losing the battle. So, dissident and revolutionary personalities tend to be degenerate, prone to violence, drug use, immoral, and nihilistic. Not all of them. The Buddha arguably was a dissident, revolutionary type of person. Like Elon Musk, you could say Elon Musk is, he's kind of, he's on the spectrum, I suppose. But he's a genius. It's like the greatest geniuses are deviant. They're not in the middle of the statistical bell-shaped curve. So the greatest geniuses, they're kind of on the lunatic fringe as a general rule. And it may be that most people on the lunatic fringe are, they tend to be degenerate, prone to violence, drug use, immoral, and nihilistic. But even so, most of the saints are there too. So it might be a little bit more of a grab bag out on the lunatic fringe, but that's where you're going to find like the most outstanding super geniuses and saints and sages. In addition to the homeless people yelling curse words on the street corners or just staggering around like zombies because they're too high on drugs to do anything other than stagger around like zombies. So I guess I answered that one. And so I'm going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question. I think there's a question mark in here. Thirdly, you say often that regret and remorse are always unwholesome mental states, but are they not obvious components in something like humility? If we forget our misdeeds, we will orient ourselves towards thinking that these things occur to others and not ourselves, that others are worse than us, or that we have some high ground here in any substantial way. Regret and remorse then seem to cripple or fragment a sense of self. It is almost remembering its imperfection actively. I also think that they are effective in preventing any further tragedy, hypocrisy, or decay of moral conduct. Shame then exists for a spiritual reason and goes far beyond the rumination of attributes you cannot control. If you read the questions from 3 to 1, there is a kind of general subtext about the usefulness of associating with those that live alternative lifestyles or are possessed by strange ideas, like me, I guess. I feel like I have wasted a lot of time and have exposed myself to so many more unwholesome mental states by abdicating the norm or the daily mundane toiling of the commoner. The line between unconventional and insane is far too ambiguous for me. Yeah, well, okay. So I guess the main gist of this question is, why are regret and remorse always unwholesome mental states? And that is what Buddhism teaches. I've already discussed this several minutes ago. But are they not obvious components in something like humility? No. Humility is very different from remorse. You can be a humble person. A lot of Burmese monks are just very humble people. I know lots of humble people, and I've never really noticed any great remorse. There's this guy I used to work with up until recently, very humble guy, and I really liked him. And sometimes he'd be hard on himself because, he might mess something up and he'd be, he'd just really just kind of take it out on himself, I guess. And it's unnecessary. There's two different things. You could say that for some people, remorse will help them to prevent doing the same misdeed again because they feel so bad through their regret after doing it. But it's unnecessary. It should be unnecessary. I mean, all you have to do is acknowledge you did something wrong and like determine, just have the determination you're going to try to do better in future. And that's it. Like it's in William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it was some heretical Christian teacher who I think he may have been killed by the Inquisition or something. But he was saying, if you're running a race and you fall down, the best thing you can do is just immediately jump back up and keep running. You don't just sit there weeping and wailing because you fell down. You're not going to win the race if you do that. The best thing you can do, if you fall down, get right back up and just keep going. And I mean, there's a lot of sense to that. There is some wisdom to that, that if you have enough sense to acknowledge that you did something wrong and just determined to try and do better in future, then all the self-loathing and the beating up yourself, all this regret and remorse is completely unnecessary. And furthermore, as I've said before, and as Buddhist philosophy teaches, Buddhist ethics, it always just makes things worse. I mean, it may have like this side effect that helps you in a certain way. It might help to keep you from doing the same thing in future. But as it says in the text, I mean, if you're going to experience shame or you're going to experience moral scruples, you should experience them before you do the misdeed and not afterwards. Afterwards, it's useless. It's just making the situation worse. So if you're going to have shame or moral scruples, you do it before the deed so that it prevents you from doing the misdeed in the first place. So let's see here. If we forget our misdeeds, well, I mean, remorse is not the same as, I mean, if you don't have remorse, it doesn't mean that you forget your misdeeds. I mean, you can still remember, I did it wrong that time. I shouldn't do it wrong that way again. I mean, that's it. That's not remorse. But it's not forgetting that you did it wrong. It's a false dichotomy in that case. So let's see here. We will orient ourselves toward thinking that these things occur to others and not ourselves. Yeah, that's if you have like this selective amnesia, which is not the same as simply not feeling remorse and regret. The others are worse than us. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that either. We have some high ground here in any substantial way. Regret and remorse then seem to cripple or fragment a sense of self. Not really. I mean, you wind up with a crippled sense of self, but still it's a sense of self. And not only is it a sense of self, it's like a crippled sense of self. But you're better off just with no sense of self. But that is for very advanced sages, I suppose. See, I also think that they are effective in preventing any further tragedy. Yeah, I mean, they can as a side effect, but it's not the best way of going about it. I mean, you can pound nails with a wrench, but I mean, that's not the best way of pounding nails. You're better off using a hammer. So, I mean, you can avoid doing misdeeds through regret and remorse, but you're better off not bothering with the regret and remorse and just having some better reason for not doing the same misdeeds. So let's see here. Shame then exists for a spiritual reason and goes far beyond the rumination of attributes you cannot control. Yeah, but the shame should come before you do the thing instead of after you do the thing. So I suppose I answered this. See, he says, I feel like I have wasted a lot of time and have exposed myself to so many more unwholesome mental states by abdicating the norm or the daily mundane toiling of the commoner. Well, yeah, I mean, I do the daily mundane toiling of the commoner, but still I can acknowledge that the commoner, as a general rule, is just flatly delusional. See, the line between unconventional and insane is far too ambiguous for me. Yeah, it's like the line between genius and insane is also rather ambiguous. Like, getting back to William James and his Varieties of Religious Experience, that he starts off the book with this discussion of how some of the greatest saints would be considered insane. I think it's George Fox. He has some passages from George Fox, who I think was the founder of the Quakers, who was a very functional person. He was like a personal secretary to Oliver Cromwell. You know, he was intelligent and everything, but he was nutty at the same time. And you just read these excerpts from his diary where this inner voice of God is having him, you know, take his shoes off and walk through the middle of this town of Lichfield, just yelling at the top of his lungs, "Woe to the bloody city of Lichfield." He has no idea why he's doing this, just God told him to, so he's doing it. Later, he found out that Christian martyrs were killed in Lichfield, what is now Lichfield, during Roman times. And he figured that was why God had him doing that. So, I mean, you want to get rid of unconventional people. I mean, you're going to get rid of progress, pretty much. Any kind of significant progress. Any kind of enlightenment. Anything that's just really, you know, way beyond the statistical norm, the bell-shaped curve. So, I mean, there is a certain amount of gambling, since most people in the lunatic fringe are just lunatics. So anyways, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And we're getting close to the end here, which is kind of good because we're going to go over 3 hours. I kind of figured we would. There's a lot of questions this time. This is from 8 Precept Erawan, who I got my suspicions that he might be a brother or a close relative of 5 Precept Pete. Anyways, 8 Precept Erawan says, "Venerable Sir, I am feeling torn between two meaningful paths, monastic life and family life. I am in Thailand now and am currently not able to ordain for at least 10 to 12 months, but I have met a wonderful woman from a good family who is also grounded in Dhamma. How might I discern the right path for me, and what qualities or practices should I focus on to make this decision with wisdom and compassion?" And that's a tough question because, of course, 8 Precept Erawan knows about the situation way more than I do, because all I know about the situation is what I just read in this paragraph. And so 8 Precept Erawan may have to, like, understand himself well enough. Like, can I be celibate for the rest of my life? And I mean, if you're a horny kind of person, a lot of guys are, that may not work very well. Or on the other hand, do you really want to become enlightened in this very life? Then it's going to be easier if you renounce the world and you don't have other people, you know, requiring your attention and like distractions and responsibilities, and maybe a little bit down the line you got children and all these attachments and responsibilities and distractions and so forth. Then, I mean, you may be just swamping yourself with distractions so that you can't really practice Dhamma effectively. But like I was saying earlier, the monastic life of just bare walls, silence, solitude, you know, renunciation, no family ties, this kind of stuff, it doesn't work for most people. And so, I mean, you're going to have to know yourself well enough, like, to know, I mean, do you want like love and family and all the ups and downs of that? Or do you want bare walls, silence, and solitude as a way of reducing distractions so that you increase somewhat your likelihood of becoming enlightened, or at least increase the amount of spiritual progress you're likely to make, unless the spiritual progress you need to make in this life is like learning how to deal better with people, and or just like sharing your life with another person and making compromises and so forth. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to just flat out tell somebody they shouldn't renounce the world, but for most people, I mean, most people just don't do it, and most people couldn't do it. And it may not be the right choice for some people who do renounce the world, and of course people who just choose to adopt the householder life, the family life. I mean, some of them might have been better off if they hadn't done that, especially after like their 3rd or 4th divorce. Not that I'm saying that 8 Precept Erawan is likely to get divorced from this Thai lady. I think it's much less likely someplace like Thailand. But yeah, it's very difficult. So let's see, how might I discern the right path for me, and what qualities or practices should I focus on to make this decision in wisdom with compassion? When I have an important decision to make and I'm not sure what the answer is, I just kind of sit there empty and just kind of wait. You just fill your head with as much information as you can, and then just let it digest until an answer comes to you. And generally, the answer is going to come to you at a time of like peace, when you're like alone. At least, you might be like lying in bed next to your mate or something, but maybe she's sleeping and you're just lying there in a contemplative state, just at ease. And it's times like that when it's more likely that the intuition of the right thing to do is going to arise. Just get as much information in as possible, and then just wait and let it digest, let it ripen and mature until the correct answer arises in a moment of like equanimity, clarity. You'll have a moment of clarity, and then the right thing will arise. But aside from that, I really don't know 8 Precept Erewhon well enough. I don't know his personality, what his character is like, to know whether he'd make a good monk or whether he'd make an even better husband and father. I really don't know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Raphael. And Raphael is our last questioner of the evening, because it's dark outside, and you can see my fish tank is in moonlight mode now. So Raphael, who asked 2 questions, this is his first question. Do you think that racial homogeneity is important for social peace? Some studies suggest that multicultural environments lead to increased mistrust among people. Do you think the racial homogeneity in Burma contributes to the overall happiness of the Burmese population? Well, Burma is multi-ethnic country, although it is true that they're pretty much segregated. And you've got like the 7 states of central Burma, they're ethnic Burmese. No, it's the 7 provinces. Yeah, I think it's the 7 provinces are just ethnic Burmese, which are kind of in the center. And then you've got 7 ethnic states around the outside. And yeah, they're pretty much homogeneous within, whatever geographic area you're in. You're going to have Burmese people, you can have like Mons in the south, and you can have, Chins in Burmese, or Shans in Burmese, and you're going to have like some Indians that live around, and they're pretty well integrated. And so, it's not 100% homogeneous, but more so than America, I suppose. So do I think that racial homogeneity is important for social peace? It's more conducive to social harmony, I think, although there have been multiracial civilizations. Rome was multiracial. I think the ancient Indus Valley civilization, the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization, which is one of the great prehistoric civilizations, that was supposedly multi-ethnic, or at least I have read that there were like East Asians and Proto-Australoids and like Mediterranean Caucasians all living together in that civilization, which lasted for centuries. So, it may be that too much peace might actually not be so good of a thing. A certain amount of upheaval and chaos may actually promote progress and a certain hardiness of the people. So, even a certain amount of like interracial, interracial, like competition, certain amount of, just having competition like strengthens things, sort of like that's the way capitalism works. You've got different like companies competing against each other, which strengthens the entire situation. So, you may have more riots and upheavals and so forth, but there's going to be like a positive side to that also. But some cultures, it's too late. You can't really just kick out the ethnic minorities. I mean, once it's already multiracial, it's pretty much going to stay that way until maybe a few centuries down the line, they're all going to be so interbred that it's just going to be one sort of light brown race or something. So which does happen. So, let's see, do I think that racial homogeneity is important for social peace? I think it's somewhat more conducive for social peace, but then again, I mean, social peace might be overrated. You know, to have a certain amount of like chaos and upheaval may actually have its advantages. So, do I think the racial homogeneity of Burma contributes to the overall happiness of the Burmese population? Maybe. Yeah, I think there is a good possibility that the fact that it's not so much racial homogeneity as just cultural homogeneity. They all see eye to eye. You know, it's a very traditionalist country. Pretty much everyone has the same, more or less, same approximate point of view. So that, I mean, you can have pretty much people getting married at random that hardly even know each other before they get married. And it's likely to work out simply because the people are so uniform that they're very likely to see eye to eye, even though they didn't know each other before they got married hardly. So it's not, I think it's more cultural homogeneity than racial homogeneity. And I think that sort of thing is, it's kind of a lost cause in a place like America. Just because there's so many different people living in America, individualism is much more valued and insisted upon than in Burma. Like in a place like Burma, I mean, you don't want to stand out. You don't want to be the weirdo. It's a conformity-based culture. So it's stable. It doesn't make much progress just because everyone thinks the same. You know, there's not much originality at all. So it is good to have different groups and just sort of even competing with each other, different religions competing with each other, just a certain amount of chaos. That's what brings about things like the Italian Renaissance. I mean, they were all Italians, I guess, but they were living in like individual city states that hated each other's guts and were having these fierce competitions with each other. And there was all this struggle against whether the Pope should be the ruler of all Italy or whether the Holy Roman Emperor should be the ruler of all Italy. And I mean, it was like chaos like brought forth the Renaissance. So, yeah, I mean, like social peace, I mean, it can be overrated. It can be just plain boring. You got to have originality and innovation and so forth in order for a nation to really prosper, especially if it's competing with other nations or other cultures. So I don't know how well I answered that question. I'm going to move on to Raphael's second question, which is the last question. I almost cussed. I almost used an expletive to emphasize that this was the last fucking question. But it's kind of a good question. It's not like a really difficult question. It's not one of those ambiguous hypothetical questions. It's just kind of a technical question, which is nice, especially to end with. And it is as follows. Are saffron-colored robes forbidden for monks to wear? And ironically, the answer is yes. Bright yellow is one of the forbidden colors of monks' robes. So it's just kind of ironic that poetically Theravada Buddhist monks' robes are called saffron robes, which I think comes from Sri Lanka, where Sri Lankan monks, as a general rule, do not follow the rules very well at all. But yeah, bright yellow is on the list of prohibited colors along with like bright orange, bright red. It's kind of strange. I think blue is out, white is out. But strangely, some colors like gray are still allowed, even though I never saw a monk wearing gray robes. But it is allowable to wear gray robes. It's just not traditional. Whereas it is traditional in some parts of the Buddhist world that bright yellow is allowable, even though technically it is forbidden. It's on the list of forbidden colors. And I think I might be confusing it with turmeric, But there is a yellow dye that in the suttas, it's used as a kind of metaphor for something that looks really good at first and then just disappears because it doesn't last. I can't remember if it's saffron dye or turmeric as dye, that you can use it as a dye and it looks really good, but you wash it once and the dye just washes right out. So yeah, my robes in Burma were generally of a kind of a reddish brown, like a russet color, which I used, see, what's it called? It's catechu. It's like the resin from a kutch tree, which is a species of acacia. And you can buy it bulk in the marketplace because some people include it in their betel quids. They chew betel nut, and sometimes they'll put some of this catechu stuff to add a kind of bitter flavor to it. And it makes good robe dye, so I would use that. So, I mean, reddish brown is definitely an allowable color. So that's what I did. But saffron, any kind of bright yellow, is actually a forbidden color. And that's it. I answered all the damn it questions. Not that I'm complaining. That's why I'm here. I do this voluntarily. I'm happy to answer questions. So even though I might cuss a little bit, doesn't mean that I'm not completely willing to answer questions. And so if you got any questions you think I can answer, I really should do this at the beginning because probably most people don't make it all the way to the end. But if you have any questions you think I can answer about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, monasticism, philosophy in general, Eastern or Western, religion in general. I mean, might not know much about particular obscure cults, but religion in general I understand fairly well, I suppose. Just me in general, that kind of thing. I can answer questions like that fairly well. And you may include your questions, no more than 3 per episode, please, in the comments below. And like I said, I may have some alt tech exclusives coming up with my friend Brian that I'm not sure whether they're going to go onto YouTube or not. That you got that to look forward to in the following days. And I guess the only thing left to say is be happy. And then I'm going to push this button and I won't be talking to you anymore until next week or maybe in a few days.